Tonight we descend beneath a medieval fortress, not through legend, but through stone, record, and patient excavation. In the 1990s, archaeologists studying castle prisons in Britain and France began comparing wall marks, iron fittings, drainage channels, and court accounts. Curators at the British Museum have long preserved shackles, keys, and legal seals from this world of guarded silence. Historians from Oxford and the University of Exeter have also traced how imprisonment grew into a tool of rule, not merely punishment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as the night settles around you, tell us where you are listening from and what time it is there. Somewhere, perhaps, your room is warm and dim. Somewhere else, rain is touching a window. In this story, that small comfort matters. You stand at the foot of a castle stair, where the air changes with every step. Above you, there are banners, smoke, roasted meat, church bells, servants, horses, and talk. Below you, there is damp stone, stale straw, and the faint metallic smell of old iron. The staircase narrows. Your shoulder nearly brushes the wall. The torchlight bends and shivers against the masonry, making the passage seem alive. A dungeon is not always the pit of storybooks. That is the first quiet surprise. Many medieval prisons were chambers within gatehouses, towers, undercrofts, or cellars. Some were high in a wall, sealed by height rather than depth. Others were below ground, where cold gathered like a living thing. The word itself grows heavy in the imagination. But the real places were varied, practical, and often more unsettling because of that. Records confirm that imprisonment in medieval Europe was commonly used to hold people while they awaited judgment, ransom, payment, or political decision. It was not always meant as a long formal sentence. That idea belongs more strongly to later centuries. Yet waiting can become its own punishment. A locked door does not need to explain itself. It only needs to remain locked. You hear the bolt slide. The sound is small, then it becomes everything. Inside the chamber, the world changes size. A person who was once measured by land, family, trade, oath, or weapon is suddenly measured by walls. The room decides how far the body may move. The guard decides when light appears. The lord, sheriff, bishop, or town official decides when the name is spoken again. In royal castles, the prison might hold a captured knight whose ransom could enrich a household. In a town prison, it might hold a debtor, a thief, a runaway servant, or a person accused in a quarrel that grew too dangerous. In an episcopal prison, it might hold someone accused of religious disobedience or moral offence. Medieval life was crowded with authorities. Each authority had doors. The mainstream picture is both simpler and stranger than the popular myth. Medieval dungeons were not built only for secret cruelty. They were part of administration, war, money, fear, and reputation. Yale historians studying medieval law have emphasized that justice depended heavily on status, local custom, and the power of whoever controlled the court. A noble prisoner and a poor labourer could share the same castle complex, yet live in entirely different worlds. One might receive wine, one might receive mouldy bread, both might hear the same rats. There is a peculiar tidbit from castle folklore that refuses to die quietly. Some old guidebooks claimed certain narrow shafts were designed only to drop prisoners into darkness and forget them. In a few places, those stories attach themselves to wells, drains, or storage pits. Modern archaeology often finds less theatrical explanations, yet the stories endure because they express a truth beyond architecture. People feared being placed where memory could not reach them. Your hand touches the wall. The stone is not smooth. It is scratched by tools, weather, repairs, and perhaps fingernails. Some prison spaces still preserve marks cut by those who waited there. Crosses, names, tally lines, crude faces, heraldic designs, and prayers appear like faint voices pressed into stone. They do not tell the whole story. They only prove that someone had time, fear, and a sharp edge. An open debate remains among scholars about how common deliberate underground confinement truly was across medieval Europe. Some historians argue that the darkest dungeon is more a later Gothic invention than a daily medieval norm. Others point to surviving prison chambers, castle accounts, and legal complaints showing that confinement could be harsh, hidden, and deadly. The truth may sit uneasily between them, as it often does. The dungeon was not only a place, it was a relationship. Someone held the key, someone did not. That difference could swallow a life. Imagine the castle above at evening. The hall glows with rushlights. Dogs sleep beneath tables. A steward counts supplies. A chaplain murmurs over parchment. Outside, the last carts creak through the gate before it closes for night. The whole fortress is a machine of order, with rooms for eating, praying, sleeping, storing, judging, and commanding. The dungeon belongs to that same machine. It is not separate from civilization. It is one of its hidden rooms. This is what makes it unsettling. The locked chamber is not an accident beneath the castle. It is part of the castle's logic. Walls protect those inside from the enemy, but they also imprison those whom power has named dangerous, useful, inconvenient, or profitable. A fortress looks outward with battlements. It looks inward with locks. You may picture a prisoner lowering himself onto straw. The straw smells sour from old damp. Somewhere in the wall, water travels slowly through a crack. The night is not silent. Silence would almost be kinder. Instead, there are little sounds that grow enormous. A chain shifts. A mouse moves. A guard coughs beyond the door. Far above, a burst of laughter rises from the hall, then fades into stone. The distance is not measured in steps. It is measured in permission. Perhaps the prisoner is guilty. Perhaps not. Medieval records do not always care enough to tell you. A name appears, then a payment, then a charge, then nothing. Sometimes the silence after the entry is the most troubling part. You find a person reduced to a line of ink, while the dungeon keeps everything the clerk left out. Hunger, shame, boredom, cold, bargaining, prayer, resentment, and the slow rearrangement of hope. There is calm cruelty in waiting without knowing how long waiting will last. A day can be endured, a week can be counted, a month begins to alter the mind. The prisoner listens for footsteps and learns their meanings. Heavy boots may mean food. Softer steps may mean a priest. Several voices may mean questioning. A key at the wrong hour may mean something worse. Yet the dungeon also reveals something about the medieval world that is often hidden by crowns and battles. It shows the everyday closeness of power. Law was not an abstract thing floating above society. It had a smell, a temperature, and a sound. It was a wooden door swollen by damp. It was an iron ring fixed into stone. It was a guard deciding whether to answer a question. As your eyes adjust to the gloom, the chamber becomes less like a movie set and more like a document. Every surface is evidence. The floor tells of use. The drain tells of bodies kept too long in one place. The latch tells of design. The scratched cross tells of someone reaching beyond the wall with the only tool left available. Perhaps this is the hidden world behind locked doors. Not endless screams, not constant spectacle, not the loud machinery of legend. Instead, it is a slower terror. A person removed from ordinary time, a body placed inside stone, a name waiting for someone powerful to remember it. And still, the castle sleeps above. The door is the first ruler of the room, not the king, not the sheriff, not the lord whose seal hangs from a folded writ, but the door itself. You face it in the half-dark, and it faces you back without expression. Oak planks, iron straps, blackened hinges, a square viewing hatch, and a lock thick enough to make argument feel childish. A medieval prison door does not need ornament. It does not need carving, grace, or beauty. Its purpose is blunt and patient. It separates breath from breath, voice from answer, body from road, and hope from ordinary movement. The wood may be rough beneath your palm, with splinters raised by years of damp. The iron feels cold even in summer. It carries a smell like rainwater, soot, and old blood from scraped knuckles. Many surviving castle and town prison accounts mention payments for locks, keys, chains, hinges, bars, and repairs. Historians at Cambridge have noted that medieval administration often appears most clearly through expenses, because money leaves trails where feelings do not. A clerk may not describe terror, but he records payment for a new bolt. He may not name loneliness, but he writes down the cost of straw. That is how the hidden world begins to speak. Not with poetry, with invoices. You hear the key turn from the other side. The sound has shape. It scrapes, pauses, catches, then settles into place with a final dull note. A person outside the door has completed a gesture that changes your entire universe. The room becomes your weather. The wall becomes your horizon. The door becomes tomorrow. Darkness in such a place is rarely pure. It moves in layers. A narrow slit may admit a grey line during the day, thin as a knife edge. A torch may pass outside and briefly paint the wall orange. At night, the darkness thickens until the body seems to float inside it. You raise your hand and do not see your fingers. You learn that darkness has weight. Records from medieval England, France, and the Low Countries confirm that prisoners often depended on outside support for food, bedding, legal help, and small comforts. A family member might send bread, ale, cloth, or coins for the keeper. A wealthy prisoner might negotiate better conditions. A poor prisoner might discover that hunger could be built into the system without anyone needing to say so aloud. There is an unsettling tidbit from several medieval prisons where visitors later found carved gaming boards scratched into stone benches or floor slabs. Simple lines, grids, and circles suggest that some prisoners fought time with little games. It is almost tender until you picture the setting. Two people crouched in dimness, moving pebbles or crumbs across cold stone. Pretending for a moment that choice still belongs to them, the mind looks for patterns. It has to. Without pattern, time becomes mud. You begin counting sounds. The guard's steps have a rhythm, heavier when he carries a bucket, slower after wine, quicker when summoned. A bell from a chapel might reach you as a muffled pulse. Morning, prayer, meal, evening, curfew. The outside world announces itself through stone, but never fully arrives. It becomes rumour in sound form. A mainstream historical fact stands quietly against the more theatrical legends. Medieval imprisonment was often custodial, meaning that people were held to ensure appearance in court, secure payment, await ransom, or keep political enemies under control. Studies of legal records by scholars at Harvard and Oxford have shown that long-term imprisonment as a standard punishment developed unevenly and became more systematic in later periods. Yet temporary confinement could stretch, decay, and harden into something far more severe. The prisoner does not live inside legal theory. The prisoner lives inside minutes. 1 minute smells of wet straw. Another smells of the latrine bucket. Another has no smell at all because the nose has surrendered. The door teaches dependence. You wait for it to open, yet you fear its opening. This is one of captivity's crueler lessons. A closed door may mean neglect, but an opening door may mean questioning, removal, punishment, or news that cuts deeper than silence. So the body becomes divided. One part listens eagerly, another part begs the footsteps to pass. There is debate among specialists about how fully medieval authorities understood the psychological effects of isolation. Some argue that darkness and confinement were simply practical results of available architecture. Others believe rulers and jailers knew very well that uncertainty, sensory deprivation, and dependence could break resistance. The written record rarely states intention clearly. Stone, however, has a way of making intention feel unnecessary. In your ears, the smallest noises become too intimate. Water drops somewhere behind the wall, a chainring taps when your wrist shifts, a rat scratches near the straw, then stops as though listening back. You hear your own stomach. You hear breath leaving you in the cold. If another prisoner is nearby, his cough becomes part of your life. If he grows silent, that too becomes part of your life. The door also changes speech. At first, a prisoner may shout. Anger rises naturally against wood, a demand, a curse, a plea, a claim of innocence. The voice strikes the planks and returns smaller. Later, speech becomes measured. You save your throat for moments when someone might hear. Later still, you may speak to yourself, to God, to the stones, or to the memory of someone who cannot answer. A priest might visit, though not always. A keeper might offer news, though news could be sold like bread. A lawyer, relative, servant, or messenger might stand outside the door and speak through an opening. The gap between faces matters. You may see only an eye, a mouth, or a hand holding a cup. Human beings become fragments. The world arrives in pieces. The door forgets you by making everyone else remember you less often. That is its deeper work. At first, people speak your name. They ask where you are held. They bring petitions. They bargain. Then harvest comes. Debts press. Children sicken. Animals stray. And ordinary life continues with a stubbornness that feels almost cruel. Your absence becomes inconvenient, then familiar. A noble captive might resist this disappearance with letters, seals, and servants. A merchant might use guild ties. A cleric might invoke church privilege. A poor woman accused of theft or disorder might have only a neighbour's memory, and memory is a fragile advocate. The door does not treat all prisoners equally, because the world outside it is not equal. There are moments when light enters and becomes almost unbearable. The hatch opens, a bowl appears. Pale daylight behind the guard makes him a dark shape, less a person than a moving piece of authority. You lift your face too quickly, your eyes sting. Then the hatch shuts, and the little square of brightness vanishes as if it never existed. Still, the mind makes chambers within chambers. You may mark days by scratches. You may save crumbs. You may create a prayer from repeated words. You may imagine the road beyond the gate, the market mud, the smell of onions, the chatter of women buying cloth, the bright stupidity of geese. Ordinary life becomes sacred only when locked away from it, and the door remains calm. It doesn't hate, it does not hurry, it simply holds. Justice begins long before the cell door closes. It begins in a field boundary, a market quarrel, a missing sheep, a whispered accusation, a broken oath, or a lord's anger hardening into command. In the medieval world, law does not always arrive wearing a robe. Sometimes it arrives on horseback. Sometimes it arrives with a clerk, a seal, and 2 men carrying a rope. You stand beside a village track at dawn, where mist lies low over the grass. A reeve calls names from a list. A manor court is gathering, and the people come slowly, wrapped in wool, carrying their grievances like baskets of stones. Someone owes rent. Someone allowed pigs into another man's barley. Someone struck a neighbour at harvest time. Most disputes will not end in a dungeon, yet every public judgment teaches the same lesson. Authority watches. Medieval justice is layered, local, and deeply personal. Kings claim the highest power, but lords hold courts. Bishops judge church matters. Towns enforce ordinances, and sheriffs move between royal command and local reality. A person can be trapped not only by a crime, but by jurisdiction. Which court hears the matter? Which lord claims the body? Which privilege protects the accused? Which enemy speaks first? Records from English county courts, French seigneurial courts, and Italian city statutes confirm that imprisonment often served as a holding measure. People were detained until trial, payment, ransom, surety, or royal decision. Scholars at Stanford have written about the importance of documentary habits in medieval governance, where growing record-keeping gave power a longer memory. A command spoken in anger might fade. A written order could travel. Ink can become iron. That is the quiet change. A clerk bends over parchment, sharpening a quill. The room smells of wax, smoke, and damp wool. He may never see the prisoner whose name he writes. He records an accusation, a debt, a warrant, a fine, a transfer, a command to hold. His hand moves carefully, because the shape of letters matters. A mistake can confuse property. A seal can decide a body. Justice is not blind in this world. It sees rank very clearly. A knight accused of rebellion may be treated as a bargaining piece. Dangerous but valuable. A merchant accused of fraud may have friends who know how to petition. A villain fleeing obligations may be dragged back into manorial control. A poor wanderer accused of theft may face suspicion before speech even begins. The law claims order, but society supplies the weight. An established historical fact gives this world its strange texture. Trial by ordeal, once used in parts of medieval Europe to seek divine judgment through fire or water, declined sharply after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 discouraged clergy from participating in such rituals. Historians from Yale and Oxford often point to this moment as part of a broader shift toward juries, inquests, and written legal procedure in England and elsewhere. The dungeon did not vanish. It adapted. Imagine a man accused of stealing a horse. The animal itself may matter less than the relationships around it. Who owns the horse? Who witnessed the sale? Who stands surety for the accused? Has he been named before? Does the sheriff need an example? The prisoner is not moving through a neat system of facts. He is moving through memory, reputation, pressure, and fear. A quirky tidbit hides inside medieval legal customs. In some places, animals could appear in legal proceedings as objects of dispute, causes of injury, or even symbolic offenders. Later medieval and early modern records include trials involving pigs, dogs, and other creatures, especially when harm was done to people. It sounds absurd at first, almost comic, until you notice the deeper idea. The community wanted disorder named, contained, and ritually answered. Medieval law often loves performance, the public oath, the spoken accusation, the witness standing before neighbours, the seal pressed into wax, the sheriff's summons read loud. Justice happens where people can see it, because seeing helps create obedience. Yet imprisonment moves part of that performance behind walls. The accused disappears, and the community is left with rumour. Rumour is its own court. It judges without benches. It punishes without chains. There is a scholarly debate over whether medieval courts became more rational across the centuries, or simply more bureaucratic. Some historians argue that written procedure and jury systems mark a genuine movement toward evidence and communal judgment. Others caution that paperwork could strengthen coercion as easily as fairness. A better record does not always mean a kinder world. It may only mean that power has learned to file things. You watch a prisoner being taken from a town square. He's not yet condemned. That distinction matters to the officials and perhaps to God, but not much to the crowd. Children follow at a distance. A woman calls out, then stops when a guard looks toward her. The prisoner's wrists are bound, not because he has been judged guilty, but because the court requires his body available. Law needs him present. The dungeon keeps him present by removing him from everyone else. In cities, imprisonment often connects to debt. A baker unable to pay, a trader accused of cheating measures, a craftsman tangled in obligation, all might find themselves held until settlement. Money and confinement sit uncomfortably close together. You can almost hear coins behind the lock. Every day inside may create new fees: food, bedding, custody, release, and written copies can all cost something. Poverty becomes stickier in a cell. In wartime, justice and strategy blur. Captured nobles may be kept securely, but not necessarily miserably, because ransom is a business. A knight with powerful relatives is worth preserving. His horse, armour, banner, and name belong to a world where violence and finance embrace one another with polished manners. Meanwhile, a foot soldier captured in the wrong raid may have little value beyond warning others. The Church also claims its share of judgment. Clerics, heresy suspects, disobedient monks, and people accused of certain moral or spiritual offences may enter prisons tied to ecclesiastical authority. Such spaces are often less visible in the popular imagination, but no less important. A monastery can be peaceful at sunrise, with bees moving through herb gardens, while a locked room nearby holds someone under correction. You might think a dungeon waits only at the end of guilt, yet in many cases it stands near the beginning of uncertainty. The prisoner is held because a matter remains unresolved. The locked chamber becomes a pause imposed by force. It buys time for officials, complainants, accreditors, or lords and kings. Time for everyone except the person inside. A court can sound orderly when read centuries later, names, dates, charges, fines, judgments. The pages lie flat beneath modern light, but each entry once had weather around it. Mud on boots, breath in cold air, a mother standing near the doorway, a prisoner trying to hear whether his name has been called, a clerk blotting ink while someone's future waits on a phrase. This is the hidden mechanism of the dungeon. It is not merely a dark room beneath a tower. It is the shadow cast by courts, customs, debts, wars, and lordship. Every locked door has a path leading to it, and that path may begin in a quarrel so ordinary no one notices its danger at first. A boundary stone is moved, a debt is denied, a rumour is believed, then law gathers itself, slowly and heavily, until someone is taken indoors and does not come out. The keeper stands where the law becomes personal. He may not wear a crown, sit in a court, or write elegant commands in Latin. Yet inside the prison, his hand decides the rhythm of another person's day. He carries the key at his belt, and the key gives him a small kingdom of hinges, bowls, straw, silence, and waiting. You hear him before you see him. His boots scrape over grit. A ring of keys knocks softly against his thigh. The sound travels along the passage with a dull little music, almost ordinary, almost domestic. It is the sound of power made portable. A lord may own the castle, but the keeper owns the moment. In many medieval records, the jailer or jailer appears as a practical officer, paid to hold bodies securely and answer to a higher authority. English legal documents, civic accounts, and castle records confirm that keepers could be fined or punished if prisoners escaped. Historians from the University of Chicago and Oxford have studied these obligations as part of medieval administration, where custody meant responsibility as much as control. A prisoner lost was not only a security failure, it could be a financial disaster. The keeper's world smells of damp leather, stale ale, smoke, and old clothing. He moves between two realms. Above, he may eat with servants, report to officials, bargain with messengers, and hear news from roads and markets. Below, he becomes the face of confinement. To the prisoner, he is breakfast, weather, rumour, danger, and possibility all at once. He may be cruel, he may be bored, he may be tired. The most unsettling thing is that he may be ordinary. Not a monster in a carved chamber, not a villain waiting in shadow, but a man with sore knees, debts, a wife, a cough, and habits shaped by work. His ordinary nature does not make captivity gentler. Sometimes it makes it worse. A system can become harsh through routine alone. A keeper controls access. He decides whether a visitor lingers or leaves quickly. He decides whether a letter is carried, delayed, opened, sold, or forgotten. He may allow extra straw for a coin. He may bring better bread for another coin. He may soften his voice when dealing with the powerful and harden it when dealing with those who have no advocate. Records confirm that prisoners in many medieval towns and castles were often charged fees for custody, food, release, or basic necessities. Harvard scholars studying medieval legal culture have noted that justice could carry costs at nearly every step. The keeper might therefore become a small merchant of discomfort. He does not need to invent suffering. He only needs to price relief. There is a strange little tidbit from some medieval prison customs in which jailers or officers demanded payment for loosening chains, improving lodging, or allowing social contact. Complaints about extortion appear often enough to suggest that captivity created its own marketplace. It is grim, almost darkly comic. Even misery develops a tariff. You picture the keeper stopping outside a door. He looks through the hatch, and the prisoner looks back. For a moment, two lives meet through a hole in wood. The keeper has slept poorly. The prisoner has not slept at all. The keeper carries a bowl. The prisoner studies the bowl as though reading fate inside it. A jailer can become messenger, and that role gives him quiet leverage. News is precious underground. A trial date, a relative's visit, a creditor's answer, a lord's mood, a rumour of war, a bishop's letter. All these things can change the temperature of hope. The keeper knows this. He may use news kindly, carelessly, or like a knife. There is an open debate among historians about how much discretion lower officers truly held in medieval justice. Some argue that keepers were tightly bound by orders, accounts, and inspections. Others suggest that distance, poor oversight, and local custom gave them wide informal power. The parchment may name the ruler. The corridor may belong to the man with the key. The keeper also fears the prisoner, though he may not admit it. A desperate person can bargain, plead, curse, bribe, attack, deceive, or die at an inconvenient time. A dead prisoner can create questions. An escaped prisoner can create punishment. A noble prisoner can create political trouble with a single complaint. Custody is authority, but it is also risk. He listens for weakness in chains. He checks bars after storms. He watches visitors' hands. He notices whether straw has been moved near a wall, whether a spoon is missing, whether a prisoner asks too many questions about the passage. His suspicion becomes professional. He reads small things because small things may become escape. At night, he may sit near a lamp while the fortress settles. Wax smoke curls above the flame. Somewhere a dog whines in its sleep. The keeper's own meal grows cold as he listens to the noises below. A cough that continues too long, a mutter rising into panic, a chain dragging where no chain should move. He may sigh, lift the keys, and go down again. You may imagine him as heartless, but medieval evidence allows a more uneasy picture. Some prisoners received favours, visits, medical attention, or better rooms through negotiation. Some keepers may have pitied certain captives, especially the sick, young, old, or politically unlucky. Mercy existed, though it depended dangerously on personality. That is not comfort. Mercy without rights is only a candle in a draught. The keeper's wife may also appear in this hidden world. In some town prisons and castle households, women connected to jailers helped prepare food, manage supplies, carry messages, or watch certain prisoners. Their names rarely survive clearly, yet their presence can be sensed in domestic traces. A prison was not always separate from household life. Sometimes captivity sat beside cooking pots, laundry, children, and ledgers. That closeness is disturbing in a quieter way. A child might grow up hearing prisoners call from below. A woman might pour ale while a debtor begs beyond a door. A servant might step around chains while carrying firewood. The prison is not outside society. It is woven into the same fabric. Dark thread crossing pale cloth. A keeper can also become an interpreter of rank. He knows who must be addressed carefully. He knows who can be ignored. He knows which visitor wears fine wool and which messenger smells of the stable. He can read clothing, speech, seal, and coin. The prisoner's condition may shift the moment a powerful name is spoken outside the door. For the powerless, the keeper's mood matters terribly. A headache, a quarrel, a lost wager, or a cup of bad ale may change the evening. The law may speak in formal phrases, but the prisoner receives it through a human temper. That is one of the dungeon's most intimate cruelties. Institutions feel cold from a distance, but up close they have breath. The keeper lifts the bowl through the hatch. His fingers are dirty, cracked, and practical. The prisoner takes the food without gratitude, or with too much gratitude, because both can be dangerous. The hatch closes, the footsteps retreat, then the keys fade down the passage. For a while, their echo remains. Rank enters the dungeon before the prisoner does. It moves ahead like a herald, invisible but powerful, arranging the straw, the bowl, the chain, the visitor, and even the tone of the guard's voice. In a medieval prison, bodies may be locked behind similar doors, but they're never made equal by stone. The world outside follows them in. You stand in a passage where two chambers face one another. In one, a captured knight waits with a servant, a cloak, and perhaps a writing tablet. In another, a poor debtor curls on damp straw, counting the sounds of footsteps and wondering whether anyone can pay what he owes. Both are confined, both hear keys, yet their captivity belongs to different stories. A noble prisoner is often a valuable possession. In war, capture may be more profitable than killing, because ransom turns violence into income. Medieval chronicles and financial records confirm that knights, lords, and highborn captives could be held for negotiated payment, political exchange, or sworn promises. Scholars at Oxford and Princeton have examined ransom culture as part of aristocratic warfare, where honour, money, and survival formed a cold little triangle. The noble captive may suffer fear, boredom, and humiliation, but he may also receive visitors, he may write letters, he may eat better food, he may be guarded carefully because his body represents wealth. If he dies, negotiations die with him. If he escapes, profit escapes too. So the prison protects its own investment, which is not the same thing as kindness. A rich prisoner can make captivity almost administrative. He sends messages to family, tenants, allies, and creditors. Horses may be sold, silver plate may be melted, land revenues may be pledged. A wife, brother, or steward begins the slow work of raising ransom. Somewhere far away, fields accounted and obligations summoned, while the captive waits behind walls with his name still carrying weight. Money has long arms, even through stone, especially through stone. A common prisoner has a shorter reach. A labourer accused of theft, a servant accused of flight, a peddler caught without trusted witnesses, or a widow tangled in debt may have few ways to pull help through the door. Their captivity may look less dramatic in records, but it can be more dangerous. They are not valuable enough to protect carefully. They are not famous enough to notice quickly. Medieval account books sometimes record prisoners by cost, not character, bread for captives, chains repaired, straw purchased, fees collected. A human life appears as an entry in a column. That fact, plain and bureaucratic, tells more than a dramatic legend. The poor prisoner becomes visible when the institution spends or receives money because of him. Otherwise, he may vanish. A mainstream historical fact rests at the centre of this world. Feudal and post-feudal society was deeply structured by status, oath, landholding, and dependency. Research from Yale on medieval social hierarchy emphasizes that legal experience varied sharply according to rank, gender, wealth, and local allegiance. The same accusation could fall differently upon different people, like rain striking roof tile, wool, and bare skin. You may picture a knight in a tower room, pacing beside a narrow window. His chain is real, but perhaps long enough to let him move. He has a blanket, a stool, and a cup. He worries about shame, ransom, reputation, and whether his enemies will exploit his absence. His prison is a negotiation chamber dressed in cold stone. Now picture a thief held in a town jail. His room is crowded, sour, and noisy. No clerk hastens to preserve his comfort. No steward rides out to bargain for him. He may survive by borrowing, begging, or promising labour after release. He may owe fees before he can leave, even if the matter is settled. Freedom itself can acquire a price tag. There is a quirky tidbit from chivalric captivity that sounds almost too polished to be true. Some highborn prisoners were allowed forms of social life, including supervised movement, games, decent meals, and polite exchanges with their captors. Captivity could resemble an unpleasant visit among enemies who shared the same aristocratic codes. It feels absurd, until you remember that these men might fight each other today and marry into each other's families tomorrow. Status could also shape chains. Heavy irons were not always used on every prisoner. Some were bound by locked rooms, guards, or promises backed by social consequences. A noble who gave his parole might be trusted under specific terms, because honour had legal and social force among elites. A poor prisoner's promise did not carry the same market value. His body might need iron where another man's name was considered enough. The scholarly debate here turns on how much medieval imprisonment reflected law, and how much it reflected bargaining power. Some historians argue that status differences were openly accepted because society itself was built on unequal rights and duties. Others stress that local variation could produce surprising outcomes, with townspeople, guild members, and organised communities sometimes defending their own effectively. The dungeon did not erase society's rules. It concentrated them. You hear a lord's messenger arriving at the gate. His horse snorts steam into cold air. The messenger carries a sealed letter, perhaps demanding better treatment for a prisoner of rank. The guard recognises the seal. The steward is called. The prisoner's name moves through the building with new urgency. Wax can soften a door more quickly than tears. Across the passage, another captive has no seal. He may scratch his name into stone because no parchment carries it for him. His mark is small, perhaps only 3 uneven letters, cut with a nail or bit of metal. Yet there is defiance in it. He places himself where the institution did not bother to place him fully. He says, without ceremony, I was here. Debt creates another kind of chain. Medieval towns depended on credit, trust, and reputation. Bakers, brewers, cloth sellers, carters, and craftsmen lived inside webs of obligation. When those webs tightened, imprisonment could enforce payment or pressure families into settlement. The locked room became part of the economy, a dark extension of the marketplace. You can almost smell the market outside: fish, onions, wool grease, horse dung, wet leather, and hot bread. The prisoner may be held only streets away from all of it, near enough to hear bells and carts, too far to touch a coin or greet a customer. That nearness is cruel. Life continues at the edge of hearing. Political prisoners occupy yet another category. They may be treated carefully or harshly, depending on their usefulness and danger. A rebel lord may require honourable custody until the king decides his fate. A suspected conspirator of lower rank may be questioned in harsher conditions. A hostage child from a powerful family may be comfortable and terrified at once. Medieval power often preferred living leverage. Even food has hierarchy. Fine bread, coarse bread, ale, water, meat, pottage, fish on fast days, leftovers from the hall, or scraps purchased by desperate relatives. The bowl tells the prisoner where he stands. The blanket tells him too. So does the guard's greeting, or lack of one. So does whether his chains are checked with caution or contempt. A fringe belief sometimes attached itself to noble captives in later tales. Certain families claimed that ancestors survived imprisonment through secret signs, hidden jewels, or prophetic dreams. Such stories are difficult to verify, yet they reveal how descendants softened captivity into legend. The dungeon becomes more bearable when transformed into destiny. Real straw, however, does not care about destiny. The deeper truth is quieter. Medieval imprisonment was not one experience. It was a spectrum of confinement shaped by wealth, name, gender, law, war, debt, and luck. Behind locked doors, the world did not become simple, it became sharper. Every inequality outside the prison returned inside. Stripped of politeness and warmed by fear, the knight waits for ransom, the debtor waits for mercy, the thief waits for judgment. The stone holds them all, but never in the same way. The body learns captivity before the mind admits it. At first, you think in reasons, names, accusations, promises, and possible rescue. Then the cold enters your feet. Hunger folds itself under your ribs. Sleep breaks into scraps. The skin begins to understand what the tongue cannot persuade anyone to change. A medieval prison is not merely seen. It is felt through the knees, the back, the teeth, and the slow ache behind the eyes. Stone steals heat without apology. Damp creeps through straw and cloth. Smoke from a distant torch reaches the chamber as a tired smell, mixed with mould, urine, old rushes, and unwashed bodies. Even breathing becomes part of the sentence. Records from castle accounts and town prisons confirm that straw, bread, ale, firewood, and chains were ordinary costs of confinement. Scholars at the University of Pennsylvania and Oxford have shown how material conditions reveal daily life more honestly than grand chronicles often do. A royal victory may fill a page with glory. A prison account tells you someone needed straw because the floor was too cold. That is history at ankle level. It is humble evidence. It is also merciless. You settle near the wall because the centre of the room feels exposed. The wall is damp, but it gives the body an edge to trust. Your shoulders curl inward. Your hands disappear inside your sleeves. If there is a chain, its weight teaches posture. If the iron is fixed low, you bend. If it is fixed high, you stretch. Either way, the architecture begins shaping the prisoner. Hunger is not always dramatic. Often it is repetitive. A bowl arrives. Thin pottage, coarse bread, watered ale, perhaps beans, onions, or scraps depending on place and luck. Sometimes the food is decent enough to keep a body moving. Sometimes it is sour, delayed, reduced, or shared among too many mouths. The prisoner studies each portion with an attention usually given to treasure. In some medieval prisons, captives relied on friends or relatives to bring food. This meant that nourishment came through social ties, not guaranteed care. A prisoner with loyal kin could survive better than a stranger arrested far from home. A poor traveller, foreign sailor, runaway servant, or nameless wanderer might feel hunger not as punishment for a crime, but as punishment for being alone. A mainstream fact sits quietly inside this suffering. Medieval Europe had no single prison system like a modern state institution. Conditions varied wildly by region, authority, building, season, and the prisoner's status. Research from Cambridge on medieval urban life often emphasises this unevenness. The same century could produce a relatively managed civic jail and a filthy holding pit only days apart by road. The body does not care about legal variety. It cares about water. It cares about warmth. It cares about whether the straw is fresh, whether lice have spread through clothing, whether the bucket is emptied, whether wounds are cleaned, whether fever brings help or only irritation from the keeper. Vermin become companions without invitation. Fleas bite under wool. Lice move through hair and seams. Rats search the straw with clever little sounds. A prisoner may guard bread under his body while trying not to sleep too deeply. You can imagine the absurd intimacy of it. A grown person defending crumbs from whiskered thieves in the dark. There's a quirky tidbit from prison archaeology that feels strangely human. Excavations in some medieval urban sites have found food remains, gaming pieces, pins, scraps of leather, and small personal objects in confinement areas. These traces suggest not only misery, but improvisation. People mended clothing, passed time, shared tools, and made small habits under pressure. Even behind locks, daily life kept trying to assemble itself. The body adapts in ways that are both brave and bleak. You learn where the floor is driest. You save the better straw for your hip. You fold cloth beneath your neck. You drink slowly when water comes. You stretch fingers and ankles to keep them from stiffening. You listen to older prisoners because survival has its own quiet teachers. Cold is worse at night. It gathers from below and descends from above. Meeting inside the bones, a cloak becomes a wall, a sleeve becomes a pillow. Breath appears pale when a torch passes near the hatch. Winter can turn confinement into a season of endurance measured by shivering. Summer brings rot, flies, and air too thick to cleanse itself. You may think the worst suffering comes from pain, but sometimes it comes from dirt. Filth reduces dignity patiently. The latrine bucket waits in the corner, and everyone knows what it is. In crowded spaces, shame has nowhere to stand apart. Bodies cough, sweat, relieve themselves, bleed, and sleep too close together. Privacy becomes a luxury almost too distant to remember. Medical help existed, though unevenly. A prisoner of rank might receive a physician, barber surgeon, herbal remedies, or better food during illness. A poorer captive might rely on another prisoner's knowledge, a visiting priest's concern, or nothing beyond endurance. Medieval medicine could be limited, but attention itself mattered. To be noticed while sick could mean life. There is debate among historians about mortality in medieval prisons because evidence is scattered and often indirect. Some argue that most holding periods were short enough to prevent widespread death in custody. Others point to complaints, crowded jails, disease, and neglect as signs of serious danger. The records rarely count suffering carefully unless it becomes legally inconvenient. The body produces its own calendar. A bruise yellows, a scab tightens, hair grows rough, nails darken. A tooth begins to ache, then rules the whole face. Sleep comes after exhaustion, not peace. Dreams become vivid because waking life has narrowed. You may dream of bread so warm that steam opens it like a blessing. Sounds affect the body too. The sudden opening of a hatch can tighten the stomach. A shout in the passage can make the heart race. Long silence can press against the ears until a prisoner invents noises from memory. Captivity trains the nerves. Even stillness becomes work. In a crowded cell, social survival matters as much as physical survival. Prisoners negotiate space, share rumours, divide food, trade insults, form alliances, and sometimes protect the weakest. Sometimes they prey on one another. A cell can become a small, unstable village without daylight, governed by hunger and personality. The strongest voice may not belong to the strongest body. It may belong to the person who knows how to keep hope organised. Prayer can also become bodily. Knees on stone, fingers counting repeated words, forehead resting against folded hands, breath slowing. Whether faith brings certainty or only rhythm, it gives the body something to do with fear. A whispered prayer may warm nothing, yet it can keep a person from dissolving into the dark. You feel the body shrink its expectations. A fresh handful of straw becomes wealth. A cup without grit becomes kindness. A guard who empties the bucket before sunset becomes almost generous. Captivity lowers the scale of desire until the smallest relief glows with unnatural brightness. Yet the body also resists. It heals cuts. It wakes again. It turns toward light. It remembers walking even when chained. Somewhere in the muscles there remains the shape of roads, stairs, fields, doorways, and open air. The dungeon can bend a person, but it must work every day to keep that bending complete. The prisoner lies down carefully. The straw whispers beneath him. The stone stays awake. Confession begins as a word, but in a dungeon it becomes a room. It waits in the corners. It hangs from the ceiling with the damp. It sits beside the prisoner when the lamp burns low, asking the same question in many voices. What did you do? What did they say you did? What are you willing to say now? You sit in the dimness while footsteps gather beyond the door. Not one guard this time, but several people. Their voices overlap in the passage, lowered but not gentle. A clerk clears his throat. Someone carries a lantern. Someone else brings a stool, perhaps because authority prefers to sit while fear stands. Then the bolt is drawn, and the room becomes crowded with purpose. Interrogation in the medieval world was not one single practice. It varied by kingdom, court, century, crime, and authority. In England, common law procedures leaned heavily on accusation, jury presentment, witnesses, and public process. In parts of continental Europe, learned legal traditions increasingly allowed more formal questioning, especially in serious cases. Scholars at Yale and Oxford have traced these differences carefully, reminding us that medieval justice was not a single dark machine. Yet to the prisoner, procedure may feel less important than pressure. The body knows the nearness of officials before the mind understands the rules. A question is asked, then asked again. A denial is received with silence. Another name is mentioned. A witness is claimed. A rumour is repeated as though it has already become fact. Rumour is useful underground. It needs no proof. It only needs fear. A prisoner may be told that friends have spoken, that accomplices have named him, that the court already knows enough, that mercy depends on honesty. Some of these statements may be true, some may be theatrical. The dungeon is an excellent stage for uncertainty because the prisoner cannot easily test what he hears. Information comes filtered through those who want something from him. Records confirm that confession held great importance in medieval religious and legal culture. A spoken admission could settle uncertainty, justify punishment, or open a path toward penance. Research from Harvard on medieval Christianity has emphasized how confession shaped the inner life of believers, especially after church reforms encouraged regular confession. The legal world and the spiritual world did not always remain separate. Both cared deeply about words drawn from the mouth. A priest might ask for sin. A magistrate might ask for fact. A lord's officer might ask for names. To the prisoner, these questions could blur. Guilt before God, guilt before court, shame before neighbours, fear before power. The soul and the body sit in the same room and both are cold. A quirky tidbit survives in the records of medieval ordeal and oath culture. People sometimes believed that a guilty person might be unable to swallow consecrated bread, speak an oath cleanly, or endure a sacred test without divine exposure. Such beliefs did not vanish all at once when formal ordeals declined. They lingered in popular imagination, giving interrogation a supernatural edge. Even silence might appear suspicious if listeners were already hungry for guilt. The clerk watches closely. He writes what matters to the court, not necessarily everything said. His parchment can make a halting answer look firm. It can make confusion look evasive. It can compress an hour of fear into a few tidy lines. This is one of history's quiet dangers. The surviving record may sound calmer than the room ever was. You hear the scratch of the pen. It is soft. It is devastating. Interrogation often involved repetition. A person was questioned, left alone, questioned again, confronted with inconsistencies, pressed by accusation, or urged toward admission. In some places and periods, physical coercion could be used under regulated conditions, especially in continental inquisitorial procedures. In others, such methods were limited, contested, or officially forbidden. The popular image of endless medieval torture chambers is often exaggerated, but exaggeration does not mean innocence. There is an open scholarly debate about the scale and regularity of coercive interrogation in medieval prisons. Some historians argue that later fiction and tourism have greatly inflated the daily use of torture in dungeons. Others point to legal manuals, inquisitorial records, and documented abuses showing that pain and threat had real institutional roles. The careful answer is uncomfortable. Legend magnifies, but it does not invent fear from nothing. The prisoner may confess for many reasons. He may be guilty and exhausted. He may be innocent and desperate. He may hope confession brings mercy. He may fear that silence brings worse treatment. He may believe that naming others will save him. He may misunderstand the question. He may answer in the language of survival, while the clerk records it as truth. This is where the dungeon becomes morally fogged. Modern listeners often want a clear border between justice and cruelty. Medieval people wanted that too, in their own ways, but their border was drawn differently and crossed often. A judge might believe he was saving a soul by pressing for confession. A town officer might believe he was protecting the market. A lord might believe fear preserved peace. A prisoner might hear only threat. The room smells of hot wax, damp wool, and breath. The lantern flame bends each time someone moves. Shadows climb the wall behind the officials, making them seem taller than their bodies. A question is placed in the air. It waits. The prisoner answers too quickly or too slowly. Both can be used against him. Names are dangerous. Once spoken, they begin to travel. An accused accomplice may be seized. A neighbour may become suspect. A servant may vanish from a household. Confession does not always end with the speaker. It can spread through a community like spilled ink through cloth. Behind one locked door, many doors may begin closing elsewhere. In religious cases, confession could carry a different weight. The goal might be correction, repentance, recantation, or proof of dangerous belief. A prisoner accused of heresy or spiritual disobedience could face questions about words spoken at meals, books handled, teachers heard, gestures made during worship, and thoughts held inwardly. The invisible life of belief was dragged into spoken form. That is a delicate violence all its own. You may imagine the prisoner alone again after questioning. The door closes, but the questions remain inside. Did he say too much? Did he contradict himself? Did the clerk write it correctly? Will those named forgive him? Will the court believe him? Will God? In this way, interrogation continues after the officials leave, because fear repeats their voices with perfect memory. The body trembles after pressure is passed. This is common in captivity. The muscles wait for danger even when the room is empty. The prisoner sits, then stands, then sits again. The straw scratches his palm. The wall seems nearer. The mind searches every sentence spoken, turning it over like a coin, looking for the side that may buy survival. Outside, officials may feel satisfied. A statement has been taken. A matter has advanced. A page has been filled. Procedure moves forward with the neat appetite of institutions. Inside, a human being has become divided between what happened, what was said, what was recorded, and what will be believed. Perhaps truth exists somewhere in that chamber. Perhaps it entered with the lantern and left with the clerk. Perhaps it remains behind, pressed into the wall by a hand that needed balance while answering. The dungeon does not reveal truth easily. It distorts sound, isolates the accused, rewards fear, and gives authority control over timing. A confession may open a door. It may close one forever. And in the pause after the last question, the locked room seems to listen. Women enter the prison through doors built by men, laws shaped by men, and accusations often carried by voices that claim to know what a woman should be. Yet once the door closes, the darkness does not become simple. A noble woman, a servant, a widow, a healer, a debtor, a suspected poisoner, a runaway wife, or a political hostage may each find a different shadow waiting for her. You stand near a tower chamber where the air smells of wax smoke and old rushes. A woman sits by the wall with her cloak folded beneath her knees. Her hair is covered, her hands are still. Outside the door, two guards speak quietly, not because they respect silence, but because they do not know what kind of prisoner she is. That uncertainty matters. A woman of rank can be dangerous even while confined, because her family name may have sharper edges than any dagger. Medieval records confirm that women were imprisoned for debt, theft, moral offences, political suspicion, religious accusations, family disputes, and crimes of violence. Scholars at the University of Michigan and Cambridge have shown that women appear less often than men in many criminal records. Yet, when they do appear, their cases reveal deep anxieties about household order, sexuality, labour, inheritance, and reputation. The prison becomes a mirror for fears carried by the street, court, and church. A noble woman might be held not because she stole, but because bloodline itself could become political. Marriage, inheritance, guardianship, and loyalty made highborn women valuable pieces in a dangerous game. A widow controlling lands might be pressured. A wife connected to rebellion might be confined. A daughter might be kept as a hostage to secure obedience from male relatives. Her body is guarded, but what power fears is the network around her. The locked room follows the family tree. It listens to surnames. It counts heirs. A woman of status may receive a chamber rather than a pit, servants rather than chains, and meals suited to rank. Yet comfort does not cancel captivity. Fine wool still scratches when the door will not open. A narrow window still frames only what power allows. A guarded room can be soft and cruel at the same time, especially when everyone calls it protection. For poorer women, imprisonment could be harsher and more exposed. A servant accused of taking cloth from her mistress may have little defence if the household turns against her. A market woman accused of cheating measures may face fines she cannot pay. A widow without strong kin may be treated as suspicious simply because she stands outside male protection. Poverty makes accusations louder. One mainstream historical fact is essential here. Medieval law often defined women through relationships, including daughter, wife, widow, servant, or mother. Research from Yale on gender and medieval legal culture has emphasized that a woman's social identity could affect how courts interpreted her actions. The same behavior might appear as disorder, necessity, sin, rebellion, or helplessness, depending on her status and reputation. The prison makes reputation physical. A respectable woman may be separated to preserve honor or avoid scandal. A woman deemed disorderly may be placed with less concern. In some towns, female prisoners were held in civic jails, gatehouses, or rooms supervised by officials and sometimes by women connected to the jailer's household. The record rarely gives them enough space, but their presence is there, pressed between legal phrases. There is a strange tidbit from medieval medical and household law. Women accused of harmful magic were sometimes linked to ordinary domestic objects, such as herbs, cords, wax figures, ointments, pots, or bread. Many such accusations were tangled with illness, jealousy, failed childbirth, livestock trouble, or neighbourhood conflict. It sounds uncanny at a distance, yet the objects are painfully familiar. The feared tools were the tools of daily life. You smell garden herbs drying near a hearth, sage, rue, lavender, rosemary. In another setting, they might suggest healing, cooking, sleep, or prayer. Under suspicion, the same scent becomes evidence in someone's imagination. A woman who knows plants may be valued when a fever breaks, then feared when a child dies. Medieval communities could turn knowledge into danger with frightening speed. It is important to move carefully here. The great witch hunts belong more strongly to the later medieval and early modern periods, not to every medieval dungeon at every time. Still, accusations of harmful magic, cursing, poisoning, or illicit healing appear in various forms across the centuries. Historians at Cornell and Oxford continue to debate how gender, theology, law, and local fear shape these cases before the larger persecutions intensified. The boundary between healer and suspect can be thin. A female prisoner also faces vulnerability inside custody itself. The sources do not always speak plainly, and silence can be troubling. A woman held among men may be at risk. A woman held separately may be isolated. A woman guarded by men may depend on their restraint. A woman guarded through a jailer's household may enter another structure of power, domestic but still coercive. The prison is never neutral for the body. Pregnancy complicates everything. A pregnant prisoner carries not only her own uncertain fate, but another life the law may acknowledge in limited ways. In some medieval and later legal traditions, pregnancy could delay execution or alter custody. Though practice varied, a midwife's examination, a court's patience, a family's plea, all might gather around one body. The womb becomes legal evidence, human vulnerability, and political inconvenience at once. You hear cloth shift in the dark. The woman touches her belly, or perhaps only folds her hands against cold. She listens for footsteps with the same attention as any prisoner. but her fears may branch differently. A child outside, a husband silent, a mistress accusing, a lord deciding, a priest asking questions about sin, a neighbour who saw too much or imagined too much. Women also used prisons actively when they could. Some petitioned, some sent messages, some appealed to kin, guilds, queens, bishops, or civic authorities. Some negotiated debts or sought sanctuary through religious networks. Medieval women were not merely acted upon, though the records often try to make them smaller. In the narrow spaces left to them, they still manoeuvred. A scholarly debate continues over whether medieval courts treated women more leniently or more harshly than men. Some studies suggest women received mercy in certain cases because they were seen as weaker or less legally independent. Others argue that this so-called leniency came at the cost of control, suspicion, and moral judgment. Mercy wrapped in condescension is still a chain. The servant's prison is different from the lady's chamber. The accused healer's fear differs from the rebel widow's. The market woman worries about fines, goods, reputation, and children who need bread. The noble hostage worries about marriage arrangements, inheritance, letters, and the mood of a king. Yet each learns the same narrow lesson. The door does not forget gender, it interprets it. Perhaps she scratches a mark into the wall, but not her full name. Perhaps only a cross, perhaps only a line for each day. Perhaps she uses a pin hidden in her sleeve, pressing softly so the sound will not carry. The mark may outlive the accusation, the guard, the court, and the person who made it. Centuries later, someone may touch it without knowing her story. That is how many imprisoned women survive in history. Not as full voices, but as interruptions, a payment for custody, a complaint about treatment, a plea from a husband, a rumour of sorcery, a royal order, a scratched sign. Their lives appear in fragments, as though the records themselves were locked rooms with only narrow slits of light. Still, you can sense them there, not silent, only unheard. The chamber holds the scent of wax, damp wool, and waiting, while a woman behind the door gathers her name around her like a cloak. Words travel strangely through stone. They do not move freely, like birds above a field, nor openly, like merchants along a road. They slip, hide, wait, fold themselves into cloth, tuck beneath bowls, pass through hands, and sometimes vanish before reaching the person who needs them most. In a prison, a message is never just a message. It is a small attempt to restore the world. You hold a scrap of parchment no larger than your palm. It smells faintly of animal skin, smoke, and the damp fingers that have handled it. The writing is cramped because space is expensive. Ink gathers darkly at the edges of certain letters. The words may be formal, pleading, affectionate, coded, angry, or frightened. Yet every line says the same hidden thing. I still exist. Medieval prisoners could and did send letters, petitions, prayers, and legal requests when status, money, guards, or luck allowed. Records from royal archives, civic registers, and noble correspondence confirm that written appeals mattered deeply in confinement. Scholars at Columbia and Oxford have studied medieval letter writing as a practical art of persuasion, where tone, humility, rank, and careful phrasing could shape survival. A badly written plea might fail before its argument began. The letter must escape before the prisoner does. That is its dangerous privilege. It passes into the hand of a keeper, a servant, a priest, a relative, another prisoner, or a bribed messenger. Each hand is a risk. The message may be read, copied, delayed, sold, altered, or quietly destroyed. A folded parchment can carry hope, but it can also carry evidence. You hear the faint scrape of a stylus. A candle trembles. The wall listens. Some prisoners dictated rather than wrote. Many people in the medieval world could not write fluently, though they might recognize marks, seals, names, or prayers. A scribe could transform a prisoner's spoken fear into a polished petition. The result may sound calm, deferential, and beautifully controlled. That elegance can mislead you. A graceful letter may have been born in a room that smelled of mildew and panic. A mainstream historical fact helps explain this hidden network. Medieval government increasingly depended on written documents, sealed orders, petitions, writs, accounts, and memoranda. Research from Princeton on documentary culture shows that writing expanded the reach of authority, but also gave subjects new ways to address power. A prisoner's plea could move through the same channels that had helped confine him. Paper could wound, then beg. A prisoner might write to a king, a queen, a bishop, a lord, a guild, a wife, a brother, or a creditor. Each audience requires a different voice. To a ruler, the prisoner may emphasize loyalty and humility. To family, urgency and need. To a creditor, practical settlement. To a religious figure, repentance and justice. The imprisoned person becomes many versions of himself, each folded into a separate appeal. There is a quirky tidbit in medieval communication that feels almost theatrical. Seals were sometimes more recognizable and powerful than signatures. A lump of wax impressed with a device could carry authority across distance, even when the recipient never saw the sender. For prisoners, lacking a seal or access to the right seal could be devastating. Their words might arrive naked, without the clothing of power. You can picture a noble captive pressing his seal into warm wax if he still has access to it. The wax smells sweet and smoky as it softens. The device leaves a tiny world in relief, perhaps a shield, beast, flower, or family sign. That mark tells the receiver that the writer is still socially alive. His body is locked, but his name still rides outward. A poor prisoner may have no such mark. He may rely on someone else's testimony, a parish priest, a neighbour, or a relative who can stand before officials. His message might not be a letter at all, but a spoken request carried from memory. That is a fragile vessel. A phrase can change, a plea can shrink, a promise can become less urgent as it travels away from the door. The hidden world of prison communication was not only written, it was scratched, sung, whispered, and prayed. Graffiti found in medieval prison spaces includes names, crosses, heraldic designs, tally marks, ships, animals, and short devotional signs. Archaeologists from British and American universities have treated these marks as evidence of confinement, memory, identity, and spiritual endurance. A wall could become a page when no parchment came. A cross scratched into stone may not tell you whether the hand trembled. A line of tally marks may not tell you what was counted. Days, meals, interrogations, promises, moons, or simply the prisoner's refusal to disappear. Still, such marks have an intimacy that official records rarely possess. They were not written for clerks. They were written against oblivion. Songs could also pass through prison walls. A melody is harder to confiscate than parchment. In some medieval stories and records, captives composed laments, prayers, political verses, or mocking lines about enemies. Whether all are factual or polished by later memory, the idea is plausible and powerful. A song can turn loneliness into pattern. It can make the voice less alone inside itself. There is an open debate among historians about how much surviving prison writing reflects ordinary captives rather than exceptional ones. Some argue that letters and polished petitions mostly preserve elite voices, leaving poor prisoners almost voiceless. Others suggest that graffiti, court complaints, and administrative fragments allow lower status prisoners to appear indirectly. The question remains delicate. The archive is not silent, but it speaks unevenly. A message from outside may be more powerful than food. Food keeps the body alive. Words can remind the body why it wants to live. A wife writes that she is trying to gather money. A father writes that the harvest has failed, but he has not forgotten. A guild brother writes that witnesses will appear. A child perhaps sends a mark beside a dictated greeting, crooked and bright with innocence. The prisoner reads slowly, then again. The words change the room. The wall remains damp, the straw remains sour, the chain remains heavy, yet the chamber is no longer complete. A road has entered it. A familiar hand has touched it. Somewhere beyond the door, another mind holds the prisoner in thought, and that thought becomes a small window no mason cut. Not all messages comfort. Some bring ruin. A ransom cannot be raised. A witness has died. A lord refuses intervention. A family has sold what little it can. A court date has moved. A spouse has remarried or disappeared from the record. News can enter the cell like winter air. A parchment may weigh almost nothing and still crush the chest. Secret codes are difficult to prove, but hints of cautious language appear across medieval correspondence. Writers often use indirection, formula, and carefully respectful phrasing, especially when letters might be intercepted. A prisoner may not accuse a guard directly. He may say his condition is hard. He may not condemn a lord. He may ask for mercy from those who understand. Medieval letters often whisper beneath their manners. The keeper knows this. He may hold a letter near the lamp longer than necessary. He may pretend not to read. He may read poorly and still understand danger. He may charge for delivery, demand a favour, or carry it faithfully because even jailers sometimes have limits. The journey of a message depends on the morals of people who live between locked spaces. You sense the prisoner hiding a scrap beneath loose straw. It might contain a prayer copied from memory, a name, a debt owed, or instructions to a family member. Perhaps it will be found tomorrow. Perhaps centuries later. Perhaps never. The hidden message is both practical and sacred because it insists on future discovery. Even prayers are messages, though the courier is invisible. A prisoner whispers into darkness because no earthly messenger is trustworthy enough. The prayer rises without parchment, seal, horse, or coin. It asks for release, forgiveness, vengeance, courage, sleep, or simply the strength not to break. Whether answered or not, it gives the prisoner a direction beyond the wall. The dungeon tries to reduce life to confinement. Messages resist that reduction. They say that identity has threads, and some threads run through stone. A name spoken outside the cell can tug gently at the person within. A scratched mark can tug across centuries at you, standing in imagination beside the wall. The parchment folds closed. The wax cools. The hand waits for footsteps. Somewhere in the dark, a prisoner trusts a few fragile words to travel farther than his body can go. Escape begins as a thought the prisoner tries not to show. It appears quietly, perhaps while the guard turns away, or while rain drums against the roof, or while one loose stone catches the edge of a fingernail. At first, the thought is too dangerous to touch. Then it returns. Then it waits beside hunger, pain, prayer, and memory, becoming almost another prisoner in the room. You feel the air shift near a barred opening. Somewhere outside, night has covered the courtyard, and the castle has grown careless in its sleep. A horse stamps in the stable. Water runs down a wall. A guard laughs far away, then coughs, then falls silent. The prisoner listens with the full body, not only the ears. Every sound becomes a possible map, Medieval escape was not usually a graceful leap from a tower into moonlit freedom. It was more often dirty, slow, desperate, and dependent on human weakness. A file hidden in bread, a rope made from bedding, a bribed servant, a drunk guard, a door left unbarred through stupidity or mercy, a wall weakened by damp, a visitor willing to lie. The romance comes later. The risk comes first. Records from English jails, town prisons, and castle accounts confirm that escapes happened often enough to worry authorities. Sheriffs, jailers, and guards could face fines for losing prisoners. Scholars at the University of Notre Dame and Oxford have studied medieval custody as a system where escape exposed the tension between legal command and practical enforcement. A prison might look solid, but every institution is made partly of people, and people get tired. A mainstream fact matters here. Medieval buildings were not designed with modern security standards. Many prisons were adapted from towers, gates, cellars, rooms, and older structures. Locks could be strong, but walls might crack. Guards could be loyal, but underpaid. Windows could be narrow, but not impossible. A dungeon was a barrier, not a miracle. The prisoner studies everything. The door hinge, the mortar line, the guard's temper, the hours between food, the direction of footsteps, the habit of one keeper to drink too much after sunset. Hope becomes a craftsman, measuring the world in inches. There is a strange tidbit from prison story across medieval Europe. Some captives supposedly escaped disguised in baskets, carts, laundry, or servants' clothing. Not every tale can be trusted, because later storytellers adored clever escapes. Yet such methods are believable, because medieval households moved goods constantly. A fortress was not sealed stone alone. It breathed through kitchens, stables, storerooms, laundries, gates, and markets. The basket is humble. That is why it works. No one fears turnips. Bribery may be more useful than digging. A coin can open what fingers cannot. A guard with debts may look away. A servant may carry a message. A laundress may hide a tool. A clerk may delay a record. Even a priest, moved by pity or politics, might help a captive communicate with allies. Escape often begins outside the prisoner's own reach. Yet bribery is never clean. The person who accepts a coin may demand another. The guard who promises help may betray the prisoner for a larger reward. A servant may panic. A messenger may be intercepted. A family member may talk too freely after ale. The escape plan grows like a web, and every strand can tremble. You imagine a prisoner scraping at mortar with a stolen nail. The sound must be controlled, tiny and patient. Too much noise means discovery. Too little progress means despair. Dust gathers under the fingernails. The wall seems almost alive in its refusal. Every loosened grain is victory, and every distant footstep is judgment. Some prisoners used bedding as rope. Sheets, strips of cloth, belts, and torn garments could be twisted together. The idea appears often in later tales, but practical attempts are not impossible. Cloth can tear, knots can slip, a wet wall can defeat bare feet. A fall may end the plan in a sound too brief for anyone to understand. An open debate among historians concerns how often medieval escapes were aided from within. Some scholars see escape as evidence of poor infrastructure and weak supervision. Others emphasize corruption, kinship networks, political sympathy, and local complicity. The truth likely shifts from case to case. A loose bar matters, but so does a guard who decides not to notice it. For noble prisoners, escape may be political theatre. A captive lord who breaks custody humiliates his keeper and revives his faction. His allies may wait with horses, cloaks, forged permissions, or armed escort. The escape must carry him beyond walls, then beyond pursuit, then into a network strong enough to protect him. Freedom is not the gate. Freedom is the road after the gate. For poor prisoners, escape can be cruelly incomplete. A man who slips from a town jail may have nowhere to go. His face is known. His accent betrays him. Hunger slows him. He lacks money, horse, cloak, or shelter. The whole countryside can become another prison if every village fears harbouring him. Running requires resources, and poverty makes even flight heavy. A woman's escape carries its own dangers. A female prisoner fleeing custody may need disguise, kin protection, religious shelter, or movement through households where questions are dangerous. A servant woman can disappear more easily in one sense, because servants are always moving. She can also be seized more easily, because her explanation may not be believed. Freedom depends on whether someone accepts her story before the pursued arrive. There are also escapes of speech rather than body. A prisoner may escape one fate by accusing another, paying a debt, giving information, agreeing to exile, making a confession, swearing obedience, or entering a monastery. Medieval freedom is not always simple release. Sometimes it is a negotiated narrowing of life. The door opens, but only onto a path already chosen by someone else. Betrayal haunts every plan. The prisoner must trust someone, and trust is expensive underground. Another captive may overhear. A guard may pretend sympathy. A relative may decide that helping is too dangerous. An ally may save himself by naming the plot. A promised horse may not appear. A hidden tool may be removed from the straw before nightfall. Escape sharpens hope until it can cut the hand that holds it. You hear the moment of discovery. Not loud at first. A changed silence. A guard stopping too suddenly outside the door. Keys lifted faster than usual. Voices gathering with a rough excitement. The prisoner has only one heartbeat to understand that the plan has failed. Then the door opens, and every loose stone, torn cloth, hidden nail, and bribed whisper becomes evidence. Punishment for attempted escape varied widely. It could mean heavier chains, worse confinement, fines, loss of privileges, public shame, or harsher judgment. A noble might face stricter guard. A common prisoner might be beaten or placed in irons. The system punishes escape not only because someone ran, but because running insults the authority that claimed to hold him. Still, people tried. That fact matters. They tried from towers, gates, pits, cellars, city prisons, and guarded rooms. They tried with tools, lies, prayers, ropes, darkness, friends, coins, and reckless courage. Every attempt says that captivity never fully owns the imagination. Even when the body is held, the mind walks passages, tests locks, counts steps, and studies light. The prisoner waits until the rain grows louder. The guard's footsteps pass once, then fade. A knot is checked, a stone shifts, breath is held. Somewhere beyond the wall, the world continues with trees, mud, starlight, dogs, roads, and all the careless space that free people forget to worship. Then a hand reaches into the dark, and freedom, if it comes quietly. The dungeon is not only beneath the castle. That is one of the quieter truths the stones keep offering, even when stories prefer towers, drawbridges, and moonlit battlements. Medieval imprisonment spreads through the town like a hidden root system. It sits under city gates, beside bridges, behind guild halls, inside monasteries, beneath civic chambers, and above busy streets where shoppers argue over onions and fish. You walk through a medieval town at daybreak. The air smells of wet timber, dung, bread ovens, river mud, and smoke from 100 hearths. Carts creak over rutted ground. A bell calls workers towards stalls and workshops. A woman lifts shutters from a shop front. A boy runs barefoot past a fountain. Life appears open, noisy, and ordinary. Then you notice the barred window above the gate. Someone is watching from behind it. The gatehouse is both passage and prison, which feels almost too symbolic. People enter the town under authority, pay tolls, show goods, answer questions, and pass beneath rooms where prisoners may be held. The same structure welcomes, controls, and confines. In many medieval towns, gates were not mere openings in walls. They were administrative thresholds, defended places, tax points, and convenient cells. Records from London, York, Paris, Florence, and other medieval urban centres confirm that civic imprisonment was deeply woven into town life. Scholars at the University of Wisconsin and Cambridge have studied how urban governments used prisons to manage debt, disorder, trade disputes, criminal accusation, and political unrest. The city did not need a remote dungeon. It had locked rooms near the market. That closeness changes everything. A prisoner in a town gate might hear the exact life he has lost. Hooves striking stone, vendors calling prices, church bells marking hours, children laughing at geese, a drunk singing too early. The world doesn't fade into distant silence. It presses itself against the wall with almost insulting cheerfulness. Castle imprisonment often belongs to lordship and war in the imagination, but civic imprisonment belongs to daily friction, debt, quarrels, licensing, theft, failed apprenticeship, broken contracts, market fraud, vagrancy, and public nuisance. The town jail is where ordinary conflict becomes bodily restraint. A baker's unpaid flour bill can lead, by enough steps, to iron. A mainstream historical fact is worth holding carefully. Medieval towns increasingly developed their own courts, officials, ordinances, and prisons as urban self-government expanded. Research from Yale on medieval civic institutions shows that city authorities used written rules and local officers to protect trade and public order. Prison was part of that civic toolkit, not merely a royal or noble instrument. The town prison might occupy a tower over a gate, a chamber under a hall, a room attached to a bridge, or a building near the marketplace. Some were notoriously unpleasant. Others were managed with enough routine to produce accounts for food, repairs, staff, chains, and bedding. The structure did not need to look dramatic. A locked chamber above a butcher's stall could be as final as any castle pit. You pause beneath a bridge where water moves slowly between stone piers. The river carries straw, vegetable scraps, and reflected clouds. Above, people cross with baskets, sacks, tools, and gossip. In some medieval cities, bridge towers served defensive and administrative functions, including confinement. The prisoner held there might hear water constantly, a sound like freedom moving away without stopping. There is a peculiar tidbit from urban prison history. Some medieval and later city prisons became known by the names of gates or bridges, making confinement part of local geography. People might say someone had been sent to a certain gate as easily as naming a street. The prison became a landmark. Imagine living in a town where punishment had an address everyone knew. Monasteries add another layer to the hidden map. You may imagine them as places of chant, beeswax, gardens, and manuscript pages, and often they were. Yet religious houses could contain spaces for correction, discipline, or confinement. A disobedient monk, a cleric under investigation, or someone under ecclesiastical authority might be held within a religious setting. The same walls that enclose prayer could enclose punishment. The scent changes there. Less market rot, more damp stone, candle wax, wool robes, dried herbs, ink, and bread from the bakehouse. A bell marks prayer hours. Sandaled feet move across cloisters. A prisoner behind a monastic door hears sacred rhythm, but not necessarily comfort. Holy order can be gentle in one room and severe in another. A scholarly debate continues over how to interpret confinement in religious institutions. Some historians emphasize discipline and penance, arguing that religious imprisonment aimed to correct the soul. Others caution that spiritual language could conceal coercion, political pressure, and institutional self-protection. A cell can be called correction, custody, or mercy. The body inside still knows whether it may leave. City halls also hold shadows. A council chamber may sit above storerooms and lockups. Men debate weights, tolls, walls, wages, and trade privileges while someone below waits for a hearing. Wax seals, account books, and civic pride live beside damp straw and iron. It is almost rude, this nearness between public order and private distress. But medieval towns are practical places. Space is used where it exists. The prison under civic authority could be loud in ways castle cells were not. Drunks shouting through the night, debtors arguing, thieves cursing guards, sick prisoners coughing, visitors calling from outside, officials moving documents, bells from different churches overlapping until time itself seems crowded. Urban captivity has less silence, but not less loneliness. Noise can isolate too, especially when none of it answers you. There are prisons connected with trade and the sea as well. Port towns might hold sailors, smugglers, debtors, foreign merchants, or men accused after tavern violence. A prisoner near a harbour might smell tar, salt, wet rope, fish guts, and foreign spices. He might hear gulls and ships' bells, those sharp little sounds of departure. Few things taunt a captive more effectively than a harbour. In some regions, castles, towns, bishops, monasteries, and private lords all held overlapping powers. This meant a prisoner's fate could depend on where he was seized, who claimed jurisdiction, and which authority wanted him most. Medieval Europe was not a smooth map of control. It was a patchwork of rights, privileges, customs, exemptions, and rival claims. A locked door might represent a town council rather than a king. You might pass a cheerful tavern whose cellar wall touches a holding room. You might buy bread near a gate where a debtor scratches tally marks above the street. You might kneel in a church while a suspect waits in a chamber nearby for ecclesiastical questioning. This is the hidden city, layered beneath the visible one. Imprisonment is not apart from life, it is embedded inside it. A fringe belief sometimes attached itself to old city prisons long after their official use faded. People claim to hear chains near gates at night, or see pale faces at barred windows. Such tales are not evidence in the usual sense. Yet they reveal how deeply these places entered civic memory. A town remembers where it confined people, even when it pretends to forget. The most unsettling part is how ordinary it all becomes. The baker passes the jail. The fishwife curses beneath the prison window. The apprentice hurries past the gate tower. The priest crosses the bridge. The prisoner hears them all, each person carrying errands, worries, and appetites through a world that has not paused for his confinement. The locked room does not need to be underground. It only needs authority. It only needs a wall. It only needs someone outside who can keep walking. Stone remembers without explaining itself. That is the trouble. You can stand inside a ruined prison chamber centuries later, with clean shoes, a guidebook, and a safe path back into daylight. Yet the wall gives you only fragments. A ring set into masonry, a groove worn near the threshold, a scratched cross, a broken shackle, a patch of floor darker than the rest. History does not open like a door. It resists. You enter a chamber where the ceiling hangs low enough to make the body cautious. Dust moves in a thin grey veil when your foot touches the floor. The air smells of limestone, old moisture, and the faint mineral coolness of places that have outlived too many names. Nothing dramatic happens. That is why it feels true. The room waits with the patience of things not required to speak. Archaeologists studying medieval prison spaces look for use, not legend. They examine tool marks, wear patterns, plaster, drainage, graffiti, food remains, metal fittings, bones, ceramics, and changes in construction. Research teams connected with universities such as York, Durham, and California institutions have shown how building archaeology can reveal daily life where chronicles stay silent. A wall can preserve habits that no clerk bothered to write down. The iron ring matters. It may have held a chain, a rope, or a temporary fastening. Its height on the wall matters too. Fixed low, it suggests restraint near the floor. Fixed higher, it may imply standing restraint, storage, or another function entirely. Evidence must be read carefully. The temptation is to make every dark object into cruelty. Good archaeology moves more slowly. Still, some objects feel heavy beyond their size. A rusted chain link sits in a museum case, lit from above, harmless behind glass. Yet its shape remembers a wrist, an ankle, a wall, a keeper, a knight. It is only iron. It is also a sentence made touchable. That double nature is what pulls the mind closer. A mainstream historical fact rests beneath this work. Medieval prisons were not always purpose-built, and many were adapted spaces within larger complexes. Studies from Oxford and the University of London have emphasised that towers, gatehouses, cellars, and chambers often shifted use across time. The room called a dungeon today may once have been storage, custody, guard space, or all three across different generations. This makes interpretation difficult. A damp cellar can become a prison can become a storeroom can become a tourist dungeon 3 centuries later, because visitors expect darkness. The stones may be real, while the story attached to them may be younger. That does not make the place meaningless. It makes it more complicated, which is usually how the past prefers to behave. You notice scratches near the wall. Some are shallow, others deeper, a cross, a line, a shape that might be a ship or might be wishful thinking. Graffiti is among the most intimate evidence because it places a hand against the stone, not a ruler's hand, not a chronicler's hand, a waiting hand. Someone made a mark because time was pressing too hard. There is a peculiar tidbit from prison graffiti studies. Ships appear surprisingly often in several confinement sites, especially in coastal or riverine regions. Some may have been carved by sailors, merchants, or prisoners dreaming of departure. Others may carry religious meaning, since a ship could symbolize the soul, the church, or passage through danger. One little scratched hull can float between memory, faith, and boredom. Graffiti refuses to behave like official evidence. It may not date itself. It may be carved by a prisoner, guard, visitor, servant, or later child with a knife. A mark can be medieval, early modern, or much later. Scholars debate these details because stone accumulates human attention across centuries. Every scratch must be questioned, even when it feels like a whisper aimed directly at you. That is the open debate in many old prison sites. How much of what visitors see truly belongs to medieval captivity, and how much has been reshaped by later imagination, restoration, tourism, and local legend? Some historians warn against turning every underground room into a chamber of horrors. Others argue that caution should not become denial, because surviving records and material traces do confirm harsh confinement in many places. The truth is uneven. It doesn't flatter us. It does not perform. Bones, when found, create another kind of silence. Not every bone in a castle or town site belongs to a prisoner. Animals were butchered, cemeteries shifted, buildings changed. Human remains require careful study, context, and respect. Yet when archaeology does identify illness, trauma, malnutrition, or cramped living conditions in confined populations, the past moves closer. It stops being architecture and becomes breath. A tooth can tell of diet. A healed fracture can suggest old injury. Bone chemistry may reveal where a person grew up or what food shaped their body. Modern science, published in journals such as Antiquity and Medieval Archaeology, has given historians tools that earlier generations lacked. The body becomes an archive, though one that must never be treated as a curiosity alone. You stand over a drain cut into the floor. It is practical, ugly, and revealing. Any place that holds bodies must manage waste, however poorly. Drainage tells you that confinement had duration. People were expected to remain long enough for filth to become a problem. A drain is not sensational. It is worse in its quiet way. It shows planning. The floor slopes slightly. Your foot senses it before your eye does. Water once moved there, carrying refuse, straw rot, spilled ale, mud from boots, and whatever else a body could not keep. The medieval prison is not only a place of fear, it is a place of maintenance. Someone emptied, repaired, swept, replaced, and locked again. Routine gave suffering a schedule. Museum displays often isolate objects, giving them clean labels and polite lighting. Key, shackle, manacle, bolt, account roll, seal. Visitors lean close, then move on. That is necessary, perhaps even merciful. Yet the original objects did not live apart. The key belonged to a hand. The shackle belonged to a limb. The account roll belonged to an office. The seal belonged to authority. Together, they formed a system. A fringe belief clings to many old prisons, especially in castles open to visitors. Guides sometimes tell of ghostly chains, cold spots, and voices in sealed rooms. These stories cannot be handled like archaeological evidence, but they reveal something about memory. When a place once held fear, later generations often invent spirits to explain the unease that evidence alone does not soothe. Perhaps the haunting is not a ghost. Perhaps it is recognition. You see the ring, the door, the marks, the narrow light, and some quiet part of the mind understands dependence. Not perfectly, not romantically, only enough to feel the distance between a free visitor and a person who once waited without knowing whether anyone would come. The stones remember most clearly where people touched them. Near the hatch, near the ring, near the corner where the floor stayed dry, near the window slit where light appeared for a short hour. Human beings leave traces where need repeats itself. A prison is repetition hardened into space. Yet the evidence never gives everything. It cannot tell you the exact tone of a mother's message, the taste of one winter's bread, the Naomi prisoner whispered before sleep, or whether a guard felt shame while locking the door. It cannot tell you which scratches were prayers and which were simply marks made to survive another hour. So you leave the chamber with uncertainty still intact. The stones have not confessed. They have only allowed you near enough to feel the outline of what happened behind locked doors. That may be all they can offer. That may be enough. The wall remains cool. The ring remains still. The silence keeps its final portion. The first night begins before darkness fully arrives. It begins at the moment the prisoner realizes that evening is no longer a gentle descent into rest, but a door closing across the mind. Outside, people prepare for sleep with habits so ordinary they would once have gone unnoticed. A mother covers embers, a servant stacks bowls, a monk closes a book, a merchant counts coins by candlelight. Somewhere, a child complains of cold feet. Inside the locked chamber, night becomes a different country. You sit with your back against the wall, trying to understand the size of the room by sound. Your eyes have not learned the darkness yet. The corners remain uncertain, and uncertainty makes them larger. A bucket waits nearby, already sour. Straw shifts beneath your legs. The floor pulls warmth away through your clothes, patiently, as though it has all winter to do its work. The first night is when captivity becomes real to the senses. Arrest still contains movement. The walk through the street, the pull on the arm, the faces watching, the command at the gate. All these things happen too quickly for the mind to settle. Even the first closing of the door can feel unreal, but night removes distraction. It leaves the body alone with the fact. Medieval records rarely pause to describe first nights in custody. They list charges, fees, guards, writs, and outcomes. Yet historians at Oxford and the University of Leeds have used court material, prison complaints, and household accounts to reconstruct the ordinary conditions of confinement. Their work shows that the smallest detail, such as bedding, light, food, and visitation, shape the emotional force of imprisonment as much as any formal sentence. A mainstream fact should rest here quietly. Many medieval prisoners were not kept in isolation. They could be held with others, especially in crowded town prisons or lower status spaces. Yet a first night could still feel profoundly solitary. Strange company does not always comfort. A stranger coughing in the dark may deepen fear rather than soften it. You hear another person breathing. That should help. Somehow it does not. If other prisoners are present, they study you without needing light. They hear how you move, how you answer, how frightened you're trying not to sound. A new prisoner changes the room. He brings rumours, risk, perhaps money, perhaps trouble. Someone asks what you're accused of. Someone else laughs softly when you hesitate. In prison, information is food, and the newly arrived carry a fresh loaf of it. If you are alone, the silence becomes crowded instead. The mind fills the space too eagerly. You imagine footsteps stopping outside the door. You imagine rats near your hand. You imagine your family learning where you've been taken. You imagine the court, the keeper, the accuser, the debt, the lord, the priest, the judge. Each thought walks around the room wearing your face. The first meal may be remembered with strange clarity. Coarse bread with a hard edge. Thin ale, safer than water in many places but not always clean enough to comfort. A wooden bowl smelling of old pottage. Maybe onions, peas, beans, oat gruel, or nothing warm at all. Hunger and disgust argue inside the mouth. Hunger usually wins. There is a quirky tidbit from accounts of confinement and household management. Straw used for bedding could be treated almost like a routine supply, purchased, replaced, or neglected depending on money and attention. That sounds dull until you imagine your first night depending on it. Fresh straw means one kind of night. Rotten straw means another. Civilization sometimes reduces itself to whether anyone bothered to change the bedding. The body searches for a position that does not exist. Lying flat makes the cold rise through the ribs. Sitting makes the back ache. Curling tightly cramps the legs. If chains are fixed, their limits define every attempt at comfort. If the room is crowded, another prisoner's knee, foot, breath, or smell becomes part of your own suffering. Sleep requires trust, and captivity has just taken trust away. The first night is also when the outside world becomes painfully detailed. You remember things you never valued enough. The feel of your own door latch, the smell of your blanket, the scrape of a chair at your table, the harmless irritation of someone snoring nearby, the small freedom of turning over in bed without measuring a chain. Memory grows precise because the present is deprived. A candle may burn for a while beyond the hatch. not inside the cell, but close enough to make a shifting line under the door. That line becomes an obsession. When it brightens, someone has passed. When it fades, the passage is empty. When it disappears completely, the prison seems to sink. You learn that light can be rationed without anyone touching your body. Scholars debate how medieval prisoners understood time in confinement, especially those without regular access to windows, bells, or visitors. Some argue that church bells and household routines helped preserve a sense of daily rhythm. Others suggest that darkness, fear, and irregular treatment could distort time severely. The first night stands at the edge of that distortion. Hours stretch because the mind has not yet learned where to place them. You count, then lose count. You pray, then forget the words. You listen, then wish you could stop listening. A rat moves somewhere close enough to make your skin tighten. Perhaps it is only straw settling, perhaps not. The first night makes every small thing suspicious. Even your own breath seems too loud, as though it might bring someone back. There is a smell to fear that people rarely admit. It is sweat beneath wool, sour breath, cold skin, and the stomach turning against itself. In a closed chamber, fear has nowhere to go. It stays with you, joining the damp, the straw, and the waste bucket. If others are afraid too, the air thickens with a shared animal knowledge. Everyone wants morning. No one knows what morning will bring. The mind tries bargaining. Perhaps this is a mistake. Perhaps someone will come. Perhaps the accuser will withdraw the charge. Perhaps the debt will be paid. Perhaps the Lord will remember a service done years ago. Perhaps the guard looked kinder than he sounded. The first night is rich in perhaps, because certainty would be too heavy to carry at once. A fringe belief sometimes whispered through medieval confinement was that dreams on the first night in a new place could carry warning or prophecy. Such ideas belong to a world where sleep, saints, omens, and conscience often touched. A prisoner might fear sleep not only because of rats or strangers, but because dreams might show judgment before the court did. The mind becomes its own chapel and its own accuser. At last, exhaustion lowers itself over you without gentleness. Sleep comes in pieces, a few breaths, a sudden waking, a sound in the passage, a dream of open ground, a return to stone. The body keeps jerking toward awareness because the room is not trusted yet. Every waking is a small arrest repeated. Then, somewhere beyond the wall, a bell sounds. Not loudly, not kindly, just enough to prove that night has moved. The first grey of morning, if it reaches you, does not free you, yet it changes the darkness from endless to counted. You have survived one night. That is not victory in the heroic sense. It is quieter and more primitive. The body remains. The breath remains. The name remains, even if no one speaks it yet. And in the first weak light, the prisoner begins learning the terrible craft of waiting. Feasting has its own weather. It gathers warmth, smoke, grease, music, candlelight, and human voices into a bright upper world where stone seems almost friendly. You stand near the great hall as evening settles and the castle changes its face. Servants move quickly with platters. Dogs nose beneath benches. A harp sounds somewhere near the wall. The fire breathes red through the chamber, and everyone leans a little closer to life. Above, power eats. Below, certain power waits. The contrast is not accidental. A castle is a vertical argument about authority. At the top are chambers of status, watchtowers, solar rooms, banners, and views across the land. At the centre is the hall, where lordship becomes visible through hospitality, judgment, display, and ceremony. Beneath or beside it are storerooms, service rooms, dark passages, and cells. The same walls contain warmth and withholding. Medieval noble households were complex communities, not just families living behind defences. Records from English and French estates confirm the presence of cooks, stewards, grooms, clerks, chaplains, laundresses, guards, pages, musicians, and guests. Historians at the University of Toronto and Oxford have shown that household order reflected political order. To feed people properly was to show control. To deny comfort was also to show control. You smell roasted meat, pepper, onions, bread, ale, wax, wet wool, and rushes laid across the floor. The hall is not quiet. It hums with appetite. Cups strike tables. A servant drops a bowl and is scolded. Someone laughs too loudly at a joke from a man too important to ignore. A clerk watches who sits near whom, because seating is never innocent. A prisoner below may hear parts of this world without seeing it. Sound travels through timber, stone, stairwells, and memory. Music descends as a blur. Footsteps pass overhead like weather. Laughter arrives softened, almost beautiful, which makes it worse. Hunger sharpens the ear. A feast above a cell becomes an instrument of comparison, playing one life against another. This is not only cruelty, it is structure. The castle must feed its people, honour guests, and display rank whether or not someone is confined nearby. Yet for the prisoner, ordinary celebration becomes a message. The world continues without you. The table is laid without you. The fire burns where you're not permitted to warm your hands. A mainstream historical fact helps anchor this scene. Medieval castles were multifunctional centres of lordship, combining defence, residence, administration, storage, justice, and display. Research from Cambridge on castle studies has emphasised that these buildings were not merely military machines. They were theatres of social order. The dungeon belongs to that theatre. Though its audience is usually one person in the dark, the feast itself can become legal atmosphere. A lord may hear petitions before dinner or issue commands after wine. Guests may discuss ransoms, marriages, disputes, and accusations while eating from shared dishes. A prisoner's fate may be mentioned between courses, almost casually. The most intimate decisions sometimes happen while hands are sticky with sauce. History is not always dignified in the moment. There is a quirky tidbit about medieval dining that suits this uneasy contrast. Trencher bread, thick slices used as edible plates, could be eaten, given to the poor, or passed to dogs after soaking up meat juices. Imagine that richness above. While someone below waits for coarse bread too hard to chew easily, one person's leftover plate might seem like a feast to the person beneath the floor. The prisoner knows feast days by sound and smell. Christmas, Easter, a lord's return, a wedding negotiation, a military victory, the visit of a bishop, the arrival of a powerful guest. More feet, more voices, better smells, more servants running through passages. The household expands and the prison feels smaller. You might think noise comforts, but it can also injure. Silence at least belongs to the cell. Laughter belongs to others. Music belongs to people whose bodies can move where they choose. The prisoner hears a dance measure and remembers feet on rushes, a hand offered, a sleeve brushing the wrist. The body remembers joy even when joy has no use for it. Scholars debate how visible prisoners were within elite medieval households. Some argue that high-status captives could be integrated into household life under supervision, dining with captors or moving within controlled spaces. Others emphasize that many prisoners, especially lower-status ones, remained physically and socially separated. The difference matters. To be captive among diners is humiliating. To be hungry beneath them is another kind of erasure. A noble prisoner might be invited to the hall under guard. He may eat at a lower place, watched by enemies who offer courtesy because courtesy is part of their language. He must manage his face carefully. Too much anger shows weakness. Too much ease suggests dishonor. A meal becomes a negotiation conducted with knives, cups, glances, and controlled breathing. A poorer prisoner receives the feast only as rumor. Perhaps scraps arrive later, cold and greasy, carried in a wooden bowl. Perhaps nothing changes at all. That is almost worse. Above, abundance has happened. Below, the same thin ration appears as if celebration were a weather system unable to descend past a certain stair. The great hall also performs justice. Many castles contained spaces where local disputes were heard, accounts examined, rents received, and orders given. A lord's meal and a lord's judgment belonged to the same culture of presence. People saw who controlled food, land, punishment, and mercy. The hall warmed the loyal and displayed the dependent. The prison held those who had become inconvenient to that display. You can feel the rough wood of a service door under your fingers. It opens into a stair smelling of spilled ale and old smoke. A servant hurries down with a bucket, muttering because some lord's guest has demanded more wine. He passes the cell door without looking through the hatch. To him, the prisoner is part of the building's work, like ashes, waste, or laundry. That indifference may sting more deeply than hatred. Hatred at least notices. The servant has errands, the cook curses in the kitchen, the steward worries about shortages, the chaplain thinks about morning prayers, the guard thinks about his feet. The prisoner becomes a background fact in everyone else's labour, and captivity becomes ordinary because it is surrounded by errands. A fringe idea sometimes appears in castle legends, claiming that prisoners were deliberately placed beneath dining halls so they would smell food and suffer more. In most cases, practical architecture explains the arrangement better than planned torment. Yet the legend survives because it captures an emotional truth. When luxury and deprivation share a wall, cruelty can exist without design. Proximity does the work. The hall grows louder as drink deepens the evening. A song rises, rough and warm. Someone pounds a rhythm on the table. The fire spits. A dog barks, and laughter follows. Beneath, a prisoner shifts on straw and feels the chain answer with a dull ring. The same night holds both sounds. Neither cancels the other. There is something profoundly medieval in this closeness between ceremony and confinement. The age did not hide all harshness away from noble life. Punishment, mercy, feasting, prayer, debt, hospitality, and violence often stood near one another. A lord could give alms in the morning, judge tenants by noon, feast at dusk, and leave a prisoner waiting at night. Human beings are very skilled at dividing themselves. You listen as the upper noise slowly thins. Guests stumble toward beds or benches. Servants gather cups. Dogs lick grease from rushes. The fire collapses inward with soft cracks. The hall cools, at last. Only embers remain above, while the lower chamber keeps its steady dark. The feast is over. The hunger is not. And somewhere in the castle's sleeping body, the locked room continues holding the part of power no song was meant to mention. Punishment in the medieval world often wants an audience. It wants eyes, whispers, memory, and the sharp little silence that falls when people understand what power can do. Not every punishment happens in public, and not every prisoner is displayed. Yet the public world presses close against the private cell. Shame, fear, warning, and order move between them like smoke under a door. You stand in a town square before noon, where market noise slowly rearranges itself around a wooden platform. The smell of fish, straw, horse sweat, and hot bread lingers in the air. People do not gather all at once. They drift closer while pretending to continue ordinary errands. A woman pauses with a basket. A boy climbs onto a cartwheel. A merchant looks annoyed, then stays. The public penalty may be brief, but its memory is meant to last. Stocks, pillories, fines proclaimed aloud, whipping in some cases, forced apology, ritual humiliation, banishment, and visible restraint all belong to a world where reputation is a kind of skin. To be shamed publicly is to be marked before neighbours, creditors, kin, rivals, and strangers who will carry the story elsewhere. A mainstream historical fact belongs here. Medieval justice relied heavily on community knowledge, public ceremony, and reputation, because local society often provided witnesses, jurors, sureties, and moral pressure. Scholars at Harvard and Oxford have shown how courts depended on what communities claimed to know about people. Public punishment did not simply hurt the body, it instructed the crowd in how to remember. The dungeon, by contrast, punishes through removal. It hides the person away, narrowing the audience to guards, officials, perhaps other prisoners, and God. Yet hidden punishment can serve public power too. A person who disappears into custody becomes a story told at wells, taverns, workshops, and church doors. The unseen cell gives room to grow. People imagine what they cannot see. That imagination becomes useful. Power understands this more often than it admits. A ruler does not need every subject to witness every act. Sometimes it is enough for people to know that a door exists, that a chamber waits, that a name can be taken from daily life. Public shame teaches through spectacle. Imprisonment teaches through uncertainty. Together, they form a language of obedience. You hear a crier speak in the square. His voice is trained to cut through barter and gossip. He names an offence, a fine, an order, or a warning. The words make law audible. People lean closer, not only from curiosity, but because information has survival value. It is useful to know what angers authority. It is useful to know who has fallen. There is a quirky tidbit in the world of medieval public shame. In some towns, offenders were made to wear symbolic objects, carry tools related to their offence, or perform humiliating acts that turned wrongdoing into a kind of moral theatre. A dishonest baker might be linked in local memory with bad bread, false weights, or public embarrassment. The punishment teaches through insult, which is very medieval, and, frankly, not subtle. The line between punishment and performance can be thin. A person in the pillory is restrained, but the crowd completes the sentence through staring, mocking, throwing refuse, or simply remembering. A fine written in a roll matters legally. A shameful display matters socially. The court orders the penalty, but the neighbourhood keeps it alive long after the wood is put away. Private imprisonment may appear less theatrical, yet it has its own script. The prisoner is brought in. The door shuts. The keeper controls access. Officials decide when to appear. The captive waits for the next scene without knowing the lines. It is a performance without applause, staged for the benefit of authority and fear. Scholars debate whether medieval punishment should be understood mainly as cruelty, correction, compensation, or communication. Some historians emphasize the harshness and inequality of penal practice. Others argue that many penalties were intended to restore order, settle conflict, or reintegrate offenders when possible. The difficulty is that a single act can do several things at once. A public apology may heal a quarrel and destroy a person's dignity. You can see this most clearly in political punishment. A rebel is not merely handled as a lawbreaker. He becomes a message to other ambitious men. A captured town leader, a disobedient vassal, or a suspected conspirator may be imprisoned in a visible fortress because the place itself speaks. Stone walls say that resistance has weight. Locked gates say that royal memory is long, at times. Rulers used confinement as a quiet alternative to bloodshed. Holding a dangerous person alive could avoid martyrdom, preserve bargaining power, or keep factions uncertain. This was not necessarily mercy in the warm sense. It could be strategy, wearing a softer cloak. A living prisoner can be moved, traded, threatened, displayed, forgotten, or suddenly remembered when politics require it. The body of the prisoner becomes a text others must read. Chains say danger. Better lodging says rank. A guarded transfer says importance. A public appearance after confinement says submission, survival, or unresolved power. Even the absence of the prisoner says something. When a familiar face no longer appears in court, chapel, market, or council, people understand that authority has acted. A fringe tradition sometimes claimed that secret underground punishments were far more common than the records admit, with hidden chambers used for enemies no one dared name. Some tales belong to later imagination, especially when old castles became tourist sites hungry for darkness. Yet secrecy did exist in political life, and unofficial pressure could leave few traces. The sensible path is neither gullibility nor denial. It is unease with discipline. Public punishment carries sound. The murmur of the crowd, the scrape of wood, the voice of the crier, the laugh that begins too sharply, the sudden silence when pain becomes visible. Private imprisonment carries different sound. The bolt, the bucket, the cough, the official voice asking whether the prisoner will comply. Both forms enter memory through the ear. The medieval crowd is not always cruel, though stories often make it so. Some spectators pity the offender, some resent the officials, some enjoy the spectacle because human beings can be disappointing in every century. Some watch because absence would be noticed. To stand in the square is also to prove that one belongs to the ordered community, at least for now. There is danger in pity. If you show too much sympathy for the punished, someone may ask why. If you mock too loudly, you may reveal a private enemy. If you leave too soon, you may appear disrespectful. Public punishment forces the crowd to perform loyalty while pretending simply to watch. The audience is never completely free. The dungeon does the same thing to visitors. A family member speaking through a hatch must choose words carefully. A servant delivering food must not linger too kindly. A priest hearing confession must move between mercy and institutional duty. Everyone near the prisoner learns the choreography of power, where to stand, how softly to speak, when not to ask. Punishment is also economic. Fines fill coffers. Confiscations enrich rulers. Fees support officers. Public shame protects trade standards. Imprisonment pressures debtors and families. Behind the moral language of order, money often waits patiently. Medieval justice can sound spiritual, honourable, and communal, but it still counts coins with great attention. You stand again near the square as the crowd begins to thin. The platform remains, ordinary wood once more. A dog sniffs near its base. The market resumes itself, because people must eat even after watching shame. The punished person is led away, perhaps released, perhaps confined, perhaps changed in ways no record will trouble to describe. That is the hidden lesson. Punishment does not end when the spectacle ends. It continues in memory, in gossip, in debt, in scars, in fear, and in the altered way a person enters a room. The dungeon may be private, but its shadow is social. Public shame may be brief, but its echo can last for years. Power speaks in many voices. Some are loud, some are locked behind doors, and somewhere between the square and the cell. Medieval society teaches everyone how close freedom stands to obedience. Holy men enter the prison carrying more than comfort. They bring candles, prayers, doctrine, authority, and the difficult promise that suffering might have meaning if the soul can be guided through it. A priest at the threshold is not merely a visitor, he is a messenger from a world larger than the court, yet he may also be part of the same structure that keeps the door locked. You hear the soft approach of sandals or worn leather shoes in the passage. The sound differs from the guard's boots. It is slower, less metallic, followed perhaps by the faint scent of beeswax, wool, and cold outdoor air. A small lamp trembles in one hand. In the other, there may be a book, a rosary, or nothing but practiced stillness. The prisoner lifts his face. This visitor does not carry food, ransom, or legal judgment. He carries words about sin, patience, mercy, fear, and eternity. That can be consolation. It can also be terrifying. When the body is trapped, the soul may feel suddenly exposed. Medieval Christianity shaped the meaning of imprisonment in profound ways. Records from monastic rules, bishops' courts, sermons, and penitential writings confirm that confinement could be understood as punishment, correction, penance, protection, or spiritual testing. Scholars at Yale and the University of Chicago have studied how medieval people imagined the soul under discipline. The prison could be a place of misery, but also a place where authorities claimed repentance might be born. That claim deserves caution. Pain does not become holy because someone names it so. Still, many prisoners must have reached for faith because little else remained within reach. Prayer asks no permission from a keeper. A whispered psalm does not need a window. A memory of church bells can enter through stone. For a captive raised in a world thick with sacred rhythms, spiritual language would not feel decorative. It would feel like part of reality's architecture. A mainstream historical fact stands quietly here. The church was one of the most powerful institutions of medieval Europe, deeply involved in education, charity, law, discipline, record-keeping, and moral life. Research from Harvard on medieval religion emphasizes that confession, penance, and pastoral care became increasingly central after major church reforms. The prisoner did not meet religion only at death. He met it in questions, counsel, and daily fear. The priest may ask whether the prisoner wishes to confess. That question changes the air. Confession can soothe the conscience, but it can also create danger if spiritual speech touches legal guilt. Ideally, the sacramental seal protects what is confessed to a priest. Yet the prisoner may not clearly separate the inner world from the court's hunger for admission. Fear makes every listener seem double. A priest can be gentle. He can sit near the prisoner, lowering his voice until the room softens. He can speak of forgiveness when everyone else speaks of debt, charge, and custody. He can bring news from family, read a prayer, or remind the guard that the captive is still human. In such moments, religion becomes a narrow bridge over despair. A priest can also be severe. He may warn of damnation, urge submission, press for repentance, or frame resistance as pride. He may believe suffering cleanses. He may tell the prisoner that earthly shame is small beside eternal judgment. Such words might be true within his belief, yet they can land hard in a cold room. Theology has weight when spoken to someone who cannot leave. There is a quirky tidbit from monastic punishment. Some religious houses use confinement, fasting, silence, or separation as tools of discipline for disobedient monks. The goal was often correction rather than simple revenge, at least in theory. Imagine a community built around prayer. Then imagine being shut away from that shared prayer because you failed its rule. The silence inside a monastery could be louder than a castle chain. The idea of prisoner's penance complicates everything. If confinement is seen as a path toward repentance, then the locked room becomes morally charged. The prisoner may be told to examine himself, remember sins, accept suffering, and prepare for judgment. Yet who decides whether the suffering is just? Who decides when the soul has learned enough? The person with the key may speak of eternity while still keeping the body cold. Scholars debate whether medieval religious involvement in imprisonment softened punishment or made it more intrusive. Some argue that priests brought mercy, advocacy, literacy, and care into brutal spaces. Others caution that spiritual authority could legitimize coercion by dressing control in sacred language. Both things could be true, even in the same corridor. A candle can reveal a face. It can also make the shadows deeper. You imagine a prisoner kneeling on stone. His knees ache quickly, but he remains there because posture matters. The priest murmurs words learned across years of training. The prisoner answers, perhaps confidently, perhaps from memory, perhaps with a voice scraped thin by fear. The guard waits outside, pretending not to listen. Everyone in this scene knows that heaven is being discussed inside a very earthly prison. Death makes the priest's role more urgent. A prisoner facing execution, illness, or despair may receive final rites, confession, or spiritual counsel. Medieval people feared dying unprepared. The state of the soul at death mattered terribly. Even harsh officials might allow a priest where they denied other visitors, not always from kindness, but from shared belief in the danger of an unshriven death. You can feel the intimacy of that moment. A candle near a pale face, a hand raised in blessing, the smell of wax and damp straw, the prisoner listening not for the court now, but for words that might carry him beyond it. Whatever modern doubts may hover at the edge of the scene, the human need is unmistakable. He does not want to vanish alone. There were also prisoners of conscience, though that phrase belongs to later vocabulary more than medieval records. People confined for religious dissent, disobedience, heresy, refusal, or conflict with ecclesiastical authority could understand imprisonment in spiritual terms of their own. One person's correction might be another person's persecution. One person's repentance might be another's betrayal of truth. A fringe belief sometimes attached to prison holiness. Stories circulated of captives receiving visions, saints appearing in dark rooms, chains breaking through miracle, or light entering where no lamp burned. Some accounts belong to hagiography and must be read with care. Yet they reveal a longing as old as confinement itself. If earthly doors will not open, perhaps heavenly ones might. The prisoner may mark a cross on the wall, not as art, but as orientation, up, down, suffering, hope. The mark turns stone into witness. It gives the hand a simple shape to repeat when thought becomes too tangled. Even someone who doubts may scratch the sign because doubt is not the opposite of fear. Sometimes doubt prays too, only more quietly. Faith does not erase hunger. It does not warm the floor or loosen the shackle. It may not persuade the lord, the sheriff, or the creditor, but it can give language to suffering when ordinary speech has failed. It can say trial, sin, mercy, endurance, and deliverance. Those words may not free the body, but they may keep the cell from becoming only a body in a room. The priest rises at last. His knees crack softly. The lamp shifts, and the shadows move across the wall. The prisoner tries to hold the feeling of being seen, because it may fade quickly after the door closes. A blessing is given. A final phrase is spoken. The guard returns to the lock. Then the corridor takes back the candle. The room grows dark again, but not quite as before. Somewhere inside the silence, a prayer continues without sound. The myths beneath reality are stubborn things. They cling to old castles like ivy, climbing over broken walls, dark stairways, and rooms where the air feels colder than it should. A guide points toward a narrow chamber and lowers his voice. A child leans closer. A visitor imagines chains, screams, hidden knives, and secret machines. The dungeon becomes a theatre before the evidence is spoken. You stand in a vaulted room lit by modern lamps. The stones are genuine, but the story may be younger. A rusted object sits behind glass, labelled with caution by a museum curator who knows how easily imagination outruns scholarship. Somewhere nearby, a souvenir shop sells tiny keys, toy helmets, and cheerful postcards of misery. There's a gentle absurdity in this, and perhaps a little shame. Medieval prisons were real. Suffering was real. Coercion, hunger, fear, darkness, and restraint were real. Yet the familiar image of the dungeon as an endless torture chamber, filled with elaborate devices and theatrical cruelty, often owes much to later centuries, antiquarian fantasy, and popular entertainment. Historians at Oxford, Cambridge, and American universities have repeatedly warned that many objects displayed as medieval torture tools are misdated, misunderstood, or exaggerated. The truth is not safer, it is only quieter, and quieter can be worse. A mainstream historical fact must be held steadily. Medieval punishment varied widely, and many penalties were public, financial, corporal, spiritual, or social rather than hidden underground procedures. Imprisonment often served custody, pressure, ransom, or correction more than formal long-term punishment. Research in journals focused on medieval legal history shows that the later prison-centered system should not be projected backward too neatly onto the Middle Ages. The myth of the torture chamber grows partly because later audiences want the past to be neatly barbaric. If the medieval world can be imagined as uniquely cruel, then modern life feels comfortingly enlightened. That is a convenient mirror. It allows people to stand in a dungeon, shiver pleasantly, and return upstairs believing cruelty belongs safely behind them. History is rarely that polite. You look at a device labelled from some earlier museum display as an instrument of torment. Perhaps modern scholars now doubt the label. Perhaps it was a restraint, a punishment object, a later invention, a theatrical reconstruction, or a tool whose purpose changed across time. The object has not changed. The story around it has. That is how myth works. It wraps iron in certainty. There is a quirky tidbit from the history of museums. In the 19th century, some collections eagerly displayed so-called medieval torture devices to attract visitors, even when their origins were unclear. The public appetite for gloomy castles, secret passages, and villainous jailers shaped what people expected to see. In other words, the dungeon became famous partly because tourism learned to whisper. Still, dismissing every grim story would be foolish. Medieval legal manuals, inquisitorial records, royal commands, civic punishments, and complaints do preserve evidence of coercive questioning, harsh confinement, mutilation in some legal contexts, and severe public penalties. The real question is not whether cruelty existed. It did. The question is where, when, how often, under what authority, and against whom. That is harder. Legends prefer fog. Scholarship asks for mud on boots. A dark chamber may have been a prison, a storeroom, a guardroom, or all three at different times. A pit may have held grain before it held a person, or never held a person at all. An iron ring may have restrained a captive, secured an animal, fastened a door, or supported equipment. Evidence must be patient because buildings change their meanings slowly. The open debate among historians concerns how to balance skepticism with moral seriousness. Some scholars argue that popular dungeon stories greatly exaggerate hidden torture and create a false picture of medieval justice. Others caution that skepticism can accidentally smooth over genuine suffering, especially the suffering of poorer prisoners whose experiences were rarely described in detail. Between melodrama and denial lies the harder path. You feel that tension inside the room. The stones ask to be believed, but not too quickly. The legends ask to be enjoyed, but they carry a cost. If everything becomes spectacle, then the actual prisoner vanishes beneath scenery. His cold, hunger, debt, fear, and waiting are replaced by dramatic machinery that may never have stood there. The myth steals attention from ordinary pain. Ordinary pain is enough. It does not need decoration. A person can be broken by waiting for judgment. A person can be frightened by the footstep of a guard. A person can become ill from damp straw, foul air, and poor food. A person can confess falsely under pressure without a single monstrous device entering the room. The small instruments of power are often more historically important than the spectacular ones. The later Gothic imagination loved the dungeon because it gathered fears neatly: darkness below, tyranny above, innocence trapped, secrets in stone. The Middle Ages became a dream landscape where modern anxieties could hide in costume. Novels, stage plays, paintings, and castle tours kept deepening the mood until every underground room seemed to require a terrible story. Yet medieval people themselves also told frightening stories. They knew prisons could swallow names. They knew rulers could be harsh. They knew accusations could travel faster than truth. They knew that a locked door changes the spirit. The modern myth may exaggerate, but it grows from older soil. Fear does not need a perfect archive to survive. You walk past graffiti carved into a wall. This feels different from the theatrical object behind glass. The scratch is small, uncertain, unprofitable. It does not boast. It does not perform. A cross, a date, a line, a name, perhaps a ship. It brings the mind closer to real captivity because it feels incomplete. The mark does not explain enough. That is why it convinces. A fringe claim often repeated in castle lore is that secret oubliettes, tiny pits where prisoners were dropped and forgotten, lay beneath every great fortress. The word itself has become almost magical in tourist storytelling. Actual examples are debated, and many alleged oubliettes were more likely storage pits, wells, or later misidentified spaces. Yet the idea endures because being forgotten is one of humanity's oldest fears. What if no one comes? What if the world closes over your name? That fear does not require an actual pit in every castle. It only requires a society where some people had the power to remove others from sight. The myth of the forgotten whole is powerful because it speaks to a real vulnerability, even when the architecture is false. Legend often misplaces truth, rather than inventing it entirely. A responsible storyteller must therefore move slowly, like someone carrying a candle through a passage with loose stones. You do not deny the darkness. You do not add monsters because the room feels too plain. You let records, walls, objects, and silence do their measured work. The past is unsettling enough when allowed to remain human. The hidden world behind locked doors is not best understood as a collection of horror props. It is a system of custody, authority, fear, negotiation, boredom, money, hunger, prayer, status, and memory. The dungeon becomes more disturbing when the machinery becomes less theatrical. It looks less like a nightmare and more like administration. That is the part that lingers. Not the imagined blade, not the stage scream, the ledger, the key, the bowl, the damp floor, the official phrase, the guard who's done this too many times. These are the things that make the story believable. They do not leap toward you from the shadows. They wait quietly until you understand that ordinary systems can hold extraordinary loneliness. The myth remains outside the door, whispering. The evidence remains inside, cooler and more patient. Between them, you stand in the dim chamber, trying to listen without being fooled. The stones do not shout. They never did, but they keep their darker truths close. Names vanish more easily than bodies. That is one of the saddest truths in the old records. A prisoner may have breathed, begged, eaten, shivered, cursed, prayed, and dreamed beneath a roof of stone. Yet all that remains is a line of ink written by someone who had other work to finish, a name, if fortune allows, a fee, a charge, a date. Then the page moves on. You sit beside a table in a dim archive, and the dungeon becomes parchment. The room smells of leather bindings, dust, dry paper, and the faint sweetness of old glue. Outside, modern traffic may murmur through a window, but here the past lies flat and fragile beneath careful hands. A scholar turns a folio slowly, and the dead return in fragments. A clerk writes that a man was held for debt. Another notes as a woman was delivered into custody. A third records payment for bread, straw, or irons. The language is plain, almost bored. That plainness is painful. Human distress enters the archive wearing the clothing of procedure. It has been trimmed to fit the margins. Medieval documents are not windows. They are filters. They preserve what institutions needed, feared, paid for, argued over, or later copied. Historians at Princeton and the University of California have long emphasized that archives reflect power as much as memory. A royal prisoner may leave letters, seals, accounts, and chronicles. A poor prisoner may leave only a cost. That cost may be small. That smallness wounds. A halfpenny for bread. A note for custody. A damaged name squeezed between other names. You lean closer, trying to grant the line the weight it once carried. Perhaps the prisoner had rough hands from harvest work. Perhaps he sang badly. Perhaps he feared dogs. Perhaps he had a sister who argued with him and loved him anyway. None of this appears. The archive does not hate him. It simply was not built to remember him fully. That may be worse. Neglect can erase without malice. Whole lives pass into records only when they disturb property, law, taxation, inheritance, marriage, obedience, or public order. The medieval prisoner becomes visible at the moment he becomes a problem. A mainstream historical fact rests here with quiet force. Medieval record-keeping expanded greatly between the 12th and 15th centuries, especially in royal, ecclesiastical, civic, and manorial administration. Research from Oxford on medieval bureaucracy shows that this growth created rich evidence for governance, but not equal evidence for every life. The archive grew powerful, yet uneven. You see this unevenness in names. A noble may be identified by title, lineage, land, and political connection. A merchant may be named with guild or town affiliation. A cleric may appear with office. A servant may be reduced to a first name. A stranger may be described by origin, trade, body, or suspicion. Sometimes a woman appears as someone's wife, widow, daughter, or maid, even when she is the one imprisoned. The missing surname can feel like a locked door. You stand before it. It will not open. There is a quirky tidbit in medieval records about nicknames. Some people appear with descriptive names based on trade, appearance, origin, temperament, or memorable accident. A prisoner might be identified as long, short, red, crooked, French, Smith, Miller, or some local phrase that once made perfect sense. These labels can feel almost intimate, though they may hide as much as they reveal. A nickname is a lantern with a cracked shade. The clerk did not write for you. He wrote for the court, the sheriff, the bishop, the town council, the lord, or the account. His duty was not sympathy. It was clarity within a system. If the fee was paid, the entry is made. If the prisoner was transferred, the note is copied. If the matter ended quietly, perhaps no more is said. Silence may mean release, it may mean death, it may mean nothing was worth recording. This uncertainty is where imagination must be disciplined. You want to fill the gap, you want to give the prisoner a face, a voice, a family, a final moment. Storytelling reaches for tenderness. Scholarship raises a hand and says, carefully. The person deserves more than invention. The record deserves more than blind trust. Between them lies a narrow path. An open debate among historians concerns how far one may reconstruct the lives of ordinary medieval people from sparse records. Some scholars argue that careful comparison allows patterns of experience to emerge from thousands of entries. Others warn that individual lives can be distorted when patterns are forced upon silence. The anonymous prisoner stands at that edge. He is both one person and part of a wider shadow. You turn another page. Here, a list of prisoners transferred between authorities. There, a charge for repairing irons. Elsewhere, a complaint that a keeper held someone improperly. The fragments begin to form not a biography, but an atmosphere. You cannot know each prisoner's face, but you can sense a system breathing. It inhales names, converts them into entries, and exhales decisions. Some records are damaged by fire, water, mice, mould, trimming, careless storage, or deliberate destruction. The loss is not always dramatic. Sometimes a corner is missing exactly where the name once sat. Sometimes ink has faded until only a ghost of a letter remains. You find yourself grieving the physical accidents of paper because they have become accidents of memory. A prisoner may disappear because a clerk omitted him, because a roll was lost, because a case settled informally, because his status was too low, because his name was common, because no one later cared to preserve that bundle. History is not merely what happened, it is what survived, and survival has never been fair. There is a darker layer in prison records involving fees. A person may appear not through accusation, but through the money required to hold, feed, chain, move, or release him. His captivity becomes legible through cost. This is unsettling because it reveals the economic skeleton beneath punishment. The prisoner is not only a moral subject or legal problem, he is an expense, a risk, a chargeable body. You might imagine a clerk at day's end. His fingers are stained with ink, his back aches, the candle burns low. He writes the last entries quickly, not cruelly, simply tired. Outside, rain strikes shutters. Somewhere under that same authority, a prisoner waits for news that may never come. The clerk sands the wet ink and closes the book. That book outlives them both. It outlives the guard, the judge, the debtor, the widow, the thief, the servant, the rebel, and perhaps the child who once carried food to the gate. Centuries later, the book opens again in a clean archive. A modern reader studies the page under soft light. The prisoner returns, but only partially, like a face seen beneath water. The names that survive are not always the names we most need. A lord who ordered confinement may be clear, a sheriff may be clear, a keeper may be clear, the prisoner may be blurred. Power signs more boldly than suffering. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is often how the documents look. Large seals, formal headings, confident hands, then small human consequences written below. A fringe belief sometimes appears among people who visit old prisons and archives. They say that if a name is spoken aloud in the place where someone suffered, the spirit of that person is comforted. There is no way to prove such a thing, yet the instinct is moving. To speak a forgotten name is to resist the final prison, which is not stone, but erasure. Perhaps that is why the archive feels almost sacred. Not because every line tells the truth completely, but because each line might be the last surviving trace of someone who once feared being forgotten. The damaged parchment becomes a fragile door. You cannot enter fully. You can only stand near it with patience. The nameless prisoners remain gathered at the edge of history. They are not empty spaces. Their presences without enough words. You sense them in the repeated costs of bread, the repairs to locks, the complaints about custody, the scratched marks on walls, and the official phrases that try too hard to stay calm. A name is written. A name is lost. A name waits in dust. And somewhere behind the broken letters, a life continues asking to be more than a line in another person's account. A dungeon does not end when the last prisoner leaves. It changes occupation. It becomes storage, ruin, memory, warning, attraction, rumour, and sometimes a place people avoid after sunset without explaining why. The lock rusts. The door sags. Rain enters through a broken roof. Ivy finds the joints between stones. Yet the room keeps a shape made by fear, and shapes can survive long after their purpose is gone. You walk through a castle abandoned by its first language. No steward calls orders. No guard demands your business. No prisoner listens for the next footstep. Wind moves through openings where shutters have vanished, carrying the smell of wet grass, old mortar, and birds nesting in the walls. The great rooms above are roofless in places, open to the sky like broken bowls. Below, the air still gathers cool and still. Abandoned prison spaces were often reused. A cell might become a store for tools, grain, barrels, firewood, old harness, or scrap iron. A tower room might become a shelter for animals. A gatehouse might continue as a lock-up under new authority. Medieval buildings rarely retired gracefully. They were patched, divided, repurposed, robbed for stone, and folded into changing worlds. A mainstream historical fact helps ground this afterlife. Many castles and civic prisons across Europe were altered substantially across the late medieval, early modern, and modern periods, especially as warfare, administration, and urban life changed. Research from Cambridge and the University of York on building archaeology emphasises that structures accumulate uses over centuries. A room is not one story. It is a stack of decisions. That stack can confuse memory. A visitor may stand inside a room restored in the 19th century, interpreted through a romantic guidebook, modified by later owners, and built partly on a medieval core. The stone may be ancient, the door may be modern, the story may be older than the door but younger than the wall. History becomes a layered fabric, and every layer claims to be the original. Yet folklore does not wait for proof. It grows wherever unease has enough darkness to take root. Villagers tell of chains heard beneath the tower. Children dare one another to touch the locked grate. A shepherd claims he saw a pale figure near the old gate at dawn. A servant refuses to fetch wine from the cellar alone. The dungeon becomes a story machine. There is a quirky tidbit in the afterlife of old prisons. In some places, spaces once used for confinement later became taverns, museums, storerooms, private cellars, or even picturesque stops for travellers. Imagine drinking ale beneath a beam once associated with custody, or viewing polished displays where someone once prayed for release. Human beings have an astonishing talent for domesticating dread. Sometimes the afterlife is deliberately theatrical. Old castles, especially from the 18th and 19th centuries onward, were made to suit romantic expectations. Owners restored battlements, deepened legends, displayed armour, collected dubious instruments, and guided visitors toward the darkest rooms. The medieval prison became part of a cultural dream, a place where modern people could feel safely frightened. This is not simply dishonesty. It is longing. People want the past to have doorways they can enter. They want ruins to tell stories in voices strong enough to hear. A damp room with a plain legal history may seem unsatisfying. Add a ghost, a betrayed countess, a forgotten prisoner, and a midnight chain, and suddenly the room feels meaningful, even if the meaning is unstable. The ghost story often replaces the missing record. Where documents fail, imagination gives a face. A nameless captive becomes a murdered monk, a loyal servant, a wronged woman, a rebel prince, or a debtor cursed by injustice. These figures may be inventions, but they reveal what later communities needed the dungeon to mean. A ghost is sometimes a moral argument wearing a sheet, and yes, occasionally a rather dramatic one. Scholars debate how to treat folklore connected to former prison sites. Some dismiss haunting tales as later fantasy with little historical value. Others argue that legends preserve emotional truths, local memory, and social unease, even when factual details are unreliable. The wisest reading may allow both caution and curiosity. A ghost story may lie about an event while telling the truth about a community's fear. You stand at the threshold of an old cell now used to store garden tools. A rake leans where a chain may once have hung. Flower pots sit on the floor. The smell is not terror, but soil, dust, and dry leaves. Yet the walls still narrow the body's attention. Even without a prisoner, the space remembers how confinement feels. Architecture can suggest old behaviour like a hand guiding the shoulder. In some places, dungeons became part of state prisons or local lockups across later centuries. The medieval chamber did not become romantic at once. It may have continued serving power under new flags, new laws, and new uniforms. A room built under a feudal lord might later hold smugglers, rebels, soldiers, debtors, or the drunk and disorderly of a town. The door changes masters. The hinge continues. The afterlife can also be archaeological. Rubble is cleared. Floors are examined. Iron fittings are catalogued. Graffiti is photographed. Layers of plaster are studied. Animal bones, pottery, glass, and charcoal are sorted in trays. The former dungeon becomes a field of evidence under white labels and careful hands. Fear is translated into context, and context into published study. There is something tender in that work. A mark cut by a bored prisoner receives more attention than it ever did when fresh. A drain once meant to carry waste becomes a clue. A broken key becomes worthy of a display case. The forgotten room receives visitors who lean close, not to mock, but to understand. Centuries can be cruel, but they can also return attention to neglected things. Tourism brings another transformation. The old prison becomes a stop on a route, a dim thrill between tea and the gift shop. People step down carefully, whisper for a moment, take photographs, and climb back into daylight. Some feel genuine sorrow. Some chase chills. Some barely pause. The room receives them all without changing expression. You may feel a slight discomfort at this. Is it right to turn suffering into atmosphere? Is it wrong to preserve a place without allowing people to feel its darkness? Museums and historic sites walk this narrow path every day. Too much spectacle dishonours the captive. Too little imagination leaves visitors unmoved. The past must be interpreted, but not consumed too greedily. A former dungeon can also become a warning against certainty. Many plaques now use careful language. This room may have served as a prison. These rings may have secured captives. This area was later altered. Such phrases can disappoint visitors hungry for drama, but they are acts of respect. Uncertainty, honestly spoken, is better than a confident falsehood. Still, the old stories persist. At night, ruins encourage them. Moonlight enters differently through broken stone. Owls call from empty windows. Wind finds cracks and makes human sounding tones. A hanging chain moves because air moves, but the mind hears intention. The body is old-fashioned in darkness. It believes quickly. Perhaps that is why former dungeons remain powerful. They gather history, legend, architecture, and bodily instinct in one place. You know you are safe, yet your skin notices the low ceiling. You know the ghost may be local invention, yet you listen when the guide pauses. You know the iron ring is only iron, yet you imagine a wrist. The room teaches through, almost. The dungeon after death is not dead. It survives as material, memory, and mood. It becomes a container for questions about justice, cruelty, rank, fear, and forgetting. It asks what societies choose to preserve, what they decorate, what they exaggerate, and what they leave unmarked under dust. A bird nests in the arrow slit. Grass grows over the outer wall. The old lock flakes into rust. And still, when the wind crosses the broken threshold, the room seems to hold its breath as though waiting for one more name to be spoken. The locked door remains because it is more than wood and iron. It is an idea with hinges. It stands wherever one person has the authority to stop another from leaving, wherever a name can be removed from sunlight and placed under supervision, wherever stone, law, fear, and habit work together until confinement begins to feel ordinary. You stand in the last dim passage, not as a prisoner, not as a judge, but as someone listening across time. The walls are cool beside you. The floor is worn in the middle, where feet once passed with food, keys, buckets, orders, and dread. The air carries no clear voice now. Only the imagination supplies footsteps, and even imagination seems careful here. There is no single answer waiting in the dungeon. That may be the most honest ending. Some prisoners were guilty, some were not. Some were dangerous, some were useful. Some were forgotten because they were poor, foreign, inconvenient, or simply unlucky. Some were treated with courtesy, some endured neglect. Some prayed themselves into endurance. Some broke. A locked door can hold many truths without arranging them kindly. A mainstream historical fact belongs to this final chamber. Medieval imprisonment was not one uniform institution, but a shifting practice shaped by lordship, royal justice, civic government, church authority, war, debt, and local custom. Scholars at Oxford, Stanford, and leading American research universities continue to show that captivity in the Middle Ages must be read through records, buildings, objects, and social rank together. No single dungeon tells the whole story. That is why the door remains partly closed. Evidence opens it a little. Silence keeps the rest. You may want the past to confess. You may want the stones to explain who suffered unjustly, who lied, who paid the keeper, who escaped, who died, who returned home changed, and who was never mentioned again. But the medieval record is uneven. It gives signatures to power and scratches to the powerless. It preserves a lord's seal more carefully than a prisoner's fear. Still, fragments survive. A key heavy in a museum drawer, a ring fixed into a wall, a court roll naming a debtor, a royal command ordering custody, a petition folded in humility, a cross carved near the floor, a drain cut because bodies were expected to remain. These are not enough to restore every life. They are enough to prevent forgetting completely. There is a strange little tidbit from old prison doors themselves. Some surviving doors show layers of repair, with newer boards over older scars, extra iron straps added later, hinges replaced, locks changed, and viewing hatches cut or sealed. A door could have a biography of its own. It learned new fears as generations changed. Even wood can become an archive, if you look at it long enough. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson. The dungeon was never only darkness. It was maintenance. Someone swept the floor. Someone counted chains. Someone repaired the bolt. Someone bought straw. Someone wrote fees. Someone carried orders. Cruelty does not always arrive with a dramatic face. Sometimes it arrives as routine performed without enough questions. This is where the story becomes slightly unsettling, because it refuses to stay safely medieval. You're not asked to pretend that every age is the same. They are not. Laws change, rights expand, institutions are challenged, records improve, and public conscience shifts. Yet the old dungeon still asks a modern question. What happens when systems learn to hide people in plain sight? The medieval locked room is distant, but the feeling it exposes is familiar. The fear of being unheard, the fear of being reduced to a file, a charge, a number, a rumour, a cost. The fear that ordinary people will walk past your suffering because supper is waiting, bells are ringing, and the day must continue. That fear is ancient, and it has not entirely left the world. Scholars continue to debate how far we should interpret dungeons as places of punishment, custody, administration, or symbolic terror. Some emphasize their practical legal role. Others stress the emotional and political power of confinement. Both readings matter. A room can hold a body for trial and still teach everyone else what authority feels like. Practical things can become symbols without asking permission. You may picture the final door standing at the end of a corridor. No torch burns there now. No guard waits with a ring of keys. Dust lies in the cracks. The lock is rusted open, perhaps removed entirely. Visitors pass through freely, and yet they lower their voices. The body understands before the mind does. This was a place where leaving was once not allowed. That knowledge changes how you breathe, only slightly, but enough. A fringe story sometimes says that if an old prison door is left open overnight, the spirits of captives may finally pass through. It is folklore, not evidence. Yet the image has a tenderness that scholarship does not need to destroy. An open door in a place of former confinement feels like a small apology, even when no apology can reach the dead. The true apology may be attention, not melodrama, not tourist thrills, not easy horror. Attention to the clerk's small entry, to the woman described only by relation, to the debtor whose release depended on coins he did not have, to the noble captive whose comfort still concealed helplessness, to the guard whose ordinary choices mattered, to the prisoners whose names have slipped through every net. You stand at the threshold and feel how the story resists conclusion. A conclusion would be too clean for a place like this. The dungeon is not a moral puzzle, with one answer hidden behind stone. It is a chamber where society's deep arrangements become visible. Rank, money, fear, law, religion, violence, mercy, habit, memory, all of them locked together. Perhaps some captives found courage there. Perhaps some found bitterness. Perhaps some discovered that hope can become very small and still remain hope. A strip of light, a word through a hatch, a cup of water brought before thirst became pain, a prayer, a scratch on stone, a promise carried outward by someone who did not betray it. The door remains because history itself has doors. Some open easily, some open after years of study, some are sealed by lost records, broken walls, and names no one wrote carefully enough. You may place your hand against one of them in thought, feeling the grain, the cold iron, the rough edge where countless hands once tested what would not move. Outside, the world is wide, roads cross fields, rivers move under bridges, bells sound over towns, bread cools on tables, rain darkens castle grass. A bird lands on a ruined sill without knowing what the room once meant. Time keeps walking, as it always does, even past the places where others were made to wait. And perhaps that is why the locked door remains in the mind. It asks you to remember those who stood on the other side, listening for a key, for mercy, for judgment, for footsteps that might never come. The passage grows still. The stone keeps its secrets. And perhaps the story is not yet complete. Word count 1168. Now let the image soften. The corridor fades first, then the iron ring, then the old wooden door with its scars and patient grain. You do not need to remain in the cold passage. You have only visited it in thought, carrying a small light and leaving no one behind. The castle grows quiet above the hill. Grass moves softly along the outer wall. Rainwater rests in the worn places between stones. The market road beyond the gate is empty now, and the last bell of the evening has already drifted into the dark. Somewhere, a room once made for fear has become only a room. Dust lies calmly on the floor. Moonlight touches the wall, not as judgment, not as discovery, but as a pale and gentle presence. The old lock no longer holds anyone. The silence no longer demands an answer. You may let the prisoners return to history, not forgotten, but no longer calling so sharply. Their marks remain where they were made. Their names, when they survive, rest in the care of quiet pages. Their unknown thoughts belong to them. There is peace in not forcing every secret open. Your own door is different. Your room is safe. The air around you is softer than stone. The night outside is only night, not custody, not sentence, not waiting without end. Breathe slowly and let the centuries settle back into distance. The candle lowers, the footsteps fade, the castle becomes a shape beneath stars, then a shadow, then almost nothing at all. And in that gentle fading, the story closes without locking. End of script. Good night.